Hello and welcome to another book synopsis with Unjustified. My name is Kim and I will be your host. To clarify a few things before we get started, I do not read the books word for word. I do change the words to my own. However, if it is direct quotes or direct legal wording and verbiage, those things I will not change. Even after you finish listening to my synopsis of this book, I highly recommend and encourage you to go purchase the book itself. In no way is my synopsis going to ever hold justice to the actual author's words. I will always leave a link in the description box below where you can purchase the book. Also, my book synopsises are not documentaries. They are not videos nor photos. These are basically like a podcast or an audible. So without further ado, let's get into this book. Secrets in the Cellar by John GLATT. This is a true story of the Austrian incest case that shocked the entire world. A life of lies and a house of horrors. Prologue. In April of 2008, on a Saturday morning at around 7 a.m., a call was taken at the Amstetten Hospital for a man claiming that there was a young girl lying unconscious against the wall in his apartment building. The man gave the address and quickly hung up the phone before he could be asked any more questions. When the ambulance arrived and the EMTs found the pale woman by a doorstep, they immediately noticed she had bald spots on her head and her mouth had dried blood, which was from her biting her tongue. Upon arrival at the hospital, she was admitted into the critical care unit. She was on the verge of death. Vital organs had failed, and she was put straight on life support. Soon afterwards, a sophisticated-looking elderly man driving a Mercedes walked into the hospital emergency department and introduced himself as this woman's grandfather, telling them that she was 19 years old and her name was Kirsten. Josef Fritzl explained that he was the person that called the ambulance to his apartment building, going on to say that he had been woken up by loud noises coming from outside his door, and the unconscious woman had a note clutched in her hand. He then handed that note to the doctor. The note, Joseph said, was written by his daughter, Elisabeth, and Elisabeth had run away from home 24 years ago to join a religious cult. As the doctor read the note, Joseph said that this is the fourth child that Elisabeth had left abandoned on his doorstep in the past 24 years since she left home. And each time she left a child on his doorstep, they were always accompanied by a note begging her father and his wife, Rosemary, to care for the child, as the cult that she was a part of did not approve of children. So he and his wife, Rosemary, had already taken in 3 other children and raised them. 2 girls, now ages 16 and 15, and a boy, now 12 years old. The doctor just stood staring and seemingly in shock, listening to Joseph explain his deranged daughter of 24 years abandoning her children without even seeing or speaking to her father in the process, only leaving a note with each discarded child. When the doctor asked Joseph if he had ever tried to find his daughter throughout all of these years, Joseph only replied by saying, "I have to leave now." It was very obvious to the doctor and the staff at the hospital that Kirsten had been the victim of years of extreme neglect. She was only 19 years old, and she was missing almost all of her teeth. Her hair had numerous bald spots, and her skin was pasty white. It was very obvious that she was severely anemic. To begin with, the doctor wanted to rule out or in what he thought may possibly be going on with this girl, and the very first thought that came to mind was she had been poisoned. But the blood test that he had run proved that this was not the case. He thought she may be epileptic due to the chewing of the tongue. While ordering tests on Kirsten, the doctor was very confused at how any mother could have discarded children on her parents' doorstep and just vanished without saying a word. So he decided to call the Amstetten police, telling them they needed to investigate the mystery around this patient named Josef Fritzl. The police were knowledgeable of Josef Fritzl and how his daughter Elisabeth had ran away at the age of 18 to join a cult. Her parents were very worried and had reported her missing to them, and the police department had investigated Elisabeth's disappearance, seeing as how she had just vanished without a trace and there were no leads. The case eventually grew cold after a year, as Elisabeth had turned 19, and by then she was an adult, which made her free to be wherever she wanted to be. Soon after, the doctor called and asked that this case please be investigated. Police went to Josef's home to talk to him, and he explained to police how he had found Kirsten outside his front door and how she had the note in her hand. He went on to tell them that Elisabeth had abandoned 3 other children in the very same way, except the other 3 were all infant babies when she abandoned them, and they all had notes with them as well. Josef gave all 4 of these notes to the police that came attached to the abandoned children. Josef also said that in January, Elisabeth had written to him and was telling him about 19-year-old Kirsten's medical issues, and she had went on to tell him that she would soon be returning home and she would be bringing her other 3 children with her when she came back. Now, these are the 3 children that she still had with her: Kirsten and 2 other boys, Stefan, age 18, and Felix, age 5. Police were not interested in reopening this decades-old missing persons case, but the doctor had made it very clear in his call to them that it was vital that the mother's medical history be known, as this was going to help him in a proper diagnosis for what was happening to Kirsten, and it could very well save her life. Police began an investigation trying to track down Elisabeth, starting with the postal code on the envelopes of the letters that she had sent to her father. Elisabeth would also be 42 years old now, but police started with schools in the area of the postal code, and then to the hospitals, police record databases, Social Security office. They left no stone unturned investigating these different avenues, and every avenue came to a dead end. There was not one piece of paper, no paper trail whatsoever on Elisabeth. Nothing. Kirsten's condition was worsening very fast. Within 2 days of being admitted into the hospital, she had been put on dialysis, and a priest had even been called in to give last prayers over her. The doctor was becoming very frustrated with the lack of concern from the grandfather and in helping to locate Elisabeth, as the doctor fully believed that finding her mother and talking to her about what led to Kirsten's condition would be the only way that her life was going to be saved. So he called Josef himself. He tried to explain how critical Kirsten's condition was and how extremely important it was to speak to her mother. But Josef was very cold and uncaring. The doctor later said that he could not understand why the grandfather could be so callous and uncaring of a grandchild when their life was in this situation. This doctor was not going to stop trying. He instructed the police to hold a public press release in the media so maybe the public could help and locate Elisabeth. He even gave his own personal cell phone number for a contact number and tip line. He called Josef back and told him that he needed a picture of Elisabeth so it could be shown during the press release by the media. Josef complied with a very old picture of Elisabeth, which he claimed was the last photo that was taken before she ran away. Doctor pleaded with the public's help in finding Elisabeth later that same day on national TV. This press release in the media brought journalists to Josef Fritzl's home the very next morning, asking for interviews and photographs of Elisabeth. Josef was very rude and aggressive to the media outside his home, and he cursed at them and ordered them all off of his property. Without Josef cooperating at all and no leads at all coming in from this press release, the next step and only step left was the Fritzl family. So days after the press release, and with Kirsten's health declining at a very rapid rate, went to the Fritzl home to collect DNA from Josef, Rosemary, and Elisabeth's 3 children that Josef and Rosemary had raised. hoping that this DNA may show possible hereditary conditions as well as possibly link the children's father, so he could be found and spoke with. If the father had a criminal record, he would be traceable by DNA. DNA was taken from everyone at the home except Joseph. He always said that he was too busy to deal with doing all that. Each time he was called about giving DNA, he always put them off, saying he had too much to do. But, shockingly to the doctor, 1 week after Kirsten was admitted into the CCU on a Saturday, the doctor received a very alarming call from Joseph. Joseph sounded very excited when he told the doctor that Elisabeth had returned. He went on to say that I am bringing her to the hospital and she wants to see her daughter. 30 minutes later, a very weak and frail woman with snow-white, thin hair slowly walked up to the receptionist desk at the hospital. The woman said in a very weak, almost whisper of a voice, "I am Kirsten's mother. I am here to help my daughter." Kirsten was then brought to the doctor to speak with him. They spoke privately for a short time, and Kirsten walked back out to her father that was waiting for her in the car. The doctor called the police after he spoke with Elisabeth, and when Joseph and Elisabeth pulled away from the hospital, police pulled them over and they were both taken to the police department for questioning. First, they talked to Elisabeth, and at this time the police did not know anything about what had been talked about between the doctor and Elisabeth. All they knew at this point was Elisabeth was a terrible mother that threw her children off on her parents. And to begin with, during their questioning, Elisabeth stuck with the story that her father had told her to tell the doctor, and that was that she ran away 24 years ago, and this is the first time that she had seen her father in 24 years. But the detective continued with the hard questions, and he became aware very fast that her story did not add up and what she was telling was not the truth. After the detective told her that he knew she was lying over and over, Elisabeth got very quiet. She took a deep breath, blew it out slowly, and said, "Okay, I will tell you the truth." But they had to make her a promise before she told them this shocking truth. "You have to promise me that my children, my mother, and myself will be protected, and you have to promise me that I will never have to see my father again." The detectives absolutely agreed. Elisabeth was quiet for a moment, while silent tears streamed down her face. "My father started raping me when I was 11 years old. Then, on August the 28th, in 1984, he drugged me and picked me up and brought me to a dungeon that is under our home. He beat me horribly and made me his sex slave. Within these 24 years, I have given birth to 7 of my father's children. One of my babies died at only 3 days old because of being medically neglected. And tonight is the first time I have been let out of the dungeon since that day in 1984 when I was taken into it 24 years ago."
The last time Josef Fritzl took the long walk to court, a dozen policemen guarding a man who's received thousands of death threats. He looked every inch someone ready to finally face judgment. This is the face of a man who's been broken. After the cameras had left, his lawyer told the jury it was the presence of his daughter Elisabeth in court this week that made him change his pleas. Fritzl himself then addressed the jury. "I'm sorry from the bottom of my heart," he said. "Unfortunately, I can't change anything now." The verdict was no surprise. The jury decided that under the family home over 24 years, Fritzl had been guilty of appalling abuse and the murder by neglect of a baby boy. Even his lawyer appears to have run out of defenses for a man regarded by so many as a monster.
It is justice, and when you think that normally for one rape you get in Austria punishment started out from 2 years, and in this case are 3,000 rapes, and you you can see that this is, of course, the only sentence that is possible.
This is where Fritzl's future will now be decided. The Mittag Institute in Vienna is the country's leading centre in deciding how to deal with those sent to secure psychiatric units. Doctors will assess key questions. Is he motivated and willing to undergo therapy? Can his personality and his attitude be changed? Is he ready for such a change? How dangerous is this man? And can, through therapy, this danger be reduced? There remains also the possibility that life might not mean life.
He could theoretically be released after 15 years at the earliest, and then of course 3 judges would have to decide again on this release.
That will ring alarm bells for many here. As Fritzl was led away to begin his sentence, the question of why he committed his crimes still hangs in the air. He is the only person who can answer that, but chooses not to. To many it seems extraordinary that 24 years of horror has been dealt with in a trial lasting just 3.5 days.
Chapter 1. A Nazi Childhood. Josef Stefan Fritzl was born on April 8, 1935, in Amstetten in Lower Austria, to Maria and Josef Sr. His mother was an extreme Roman Catholic, and she ruled their family with an iron fist. His father was totally controlled by Maria as well. Josef Sr. was a poor farmer. Josef Jr. was an only child. His mother was very strict and abusive with her extreme discipline. Shortly before Josef Jr. turned 3 years old, Hitler made his amazing arrival into Amstetten. Maria and Josef Jr. was present at the welcoming arrival of Hitler and was saluting him as he drove by in his very fancy car. Everyone was cheering and welcoming Hitler into their community. Later, Hitler made a public appreciation letter to the citizens for being so welcoming to him and for making him an honorary citizen of Amstetten. 1 year afterwards, Maria kicked Josef Sr. out of their apartment and divorced him for not providing enough money for their family. Josef Sr. went on to fight in the Nazi war as a stormtrooper, and he was killed at war only a few years later. Josef Jr. idolized his mother growing up, but he despised his father. He thought of him as being a complete loser. Maria encouraged Josef Jr. to join the Hitler Youth movement during the war. Maria would also beat Josef Jr. terribly to discipline him, even going years without getting him medical attention for a urinary tract that was almost unbearably painful to him at such a young age. His future sister-in-law later said that Maria would beat Josef black and blue almost every day. Later, Josef even admitted that his mother would beat him and leave him in a pool of his own blood, saying that she called him a Satan and a no-good criminal. She never gave him a hug or a kiss or showed any sort of love to him whatsoever. The only thing she ever done with him was go to church. Yet Josef idolized his mother and thought of her as being the most perfect woman in this whole world. Life was not easy for Josef and his mother. Divorce was frowned upon by the Roman Catholic religion, and they were very poor, and many times even had to rely on handouts for food just to keep from starving to death. When Josef started elementary school during the war, his teachers were very impressed with him, being so highly intelligent and having such a straightforward approach and mind. Josef was also very popular with the other kids at school, and they gave him the nickname of Sepp Pepper. The war was very active during his early school and childhood years, with helicopters dropping bombs over their town. Maria and Josef spent many nights sleeping in the fallout shelters to have protection from the war. It was later claimed that as the bombs were being dropped over their town, his mother, Maria, was sexually molesting her young son, Josef. During all of this, the execution and euthanization camps were very active. Thousands of citizens were being both executed as well as euthanized from the various concentration camps throughout Germany. Most of these people being put to death were psychiatric and elderly, so Hitler considered them unnecessary mouths to feed. Josef saw these people lined up awaiting their own deaths every day as he walked to school. Josef was actually fascinated by this camp. Amstetten was almost destroyed by the Allied attacks during the war, and just walking through the town was very dangerous, especially around the train station, as there were many undetonated bombs still hidden everywhere. Josef and his mother lived in the poorest community in Amstetten, and even though he was a handsome, black-haired, blue-eyed guy, he was very much a loner. Instead of joining the other kids in the streets and playing soccer, he would read any book that he could get his hands on. When he was 12 years old, he started going to a secondary school. Former classmates remembered him as being awkward and having a weird haircut that his mom had given him. Josef referred to himself as an alibi child, saying that the only reason his mother even had him to begin with was only to prove to his dad that she could indeed have children, adding that he was born with an evil streak, and he had fought against this his entire life. He also admitted that he always had sexual fantasies about his mother his entire life, saying he would love his mother across any and all boundaries, and that he was very proud of himself for always resisting his strong urges to live out his sexual fantasies on his mother. In 2008, while being interviewed by a newspaper, Josef said, quote, "It is complete rubbish that my mother sexually abused me, even though you could sort of describe me as being her man, as she was the boss at home and I was the only man in the house." Even through the war and the poverty that he was raised in, Josef had the reputation at school by his teachers as being a fantastic student. He was very well behaved, and he never got into any trouble, as well as he was extremely intelligent. Chapter 2. Starting a Family. When Josef graduated school, he enrolled into a college for a 1-year educational engineering course. Josef aced the class, and upon completion, he found a good job in Linz. This is where Adolf Hitler spent the majority of his childhood. Linz is about 40 miles west of Amstetten. Josef and Maria moved there. The book goes into great detail explaining Germany and the war, as well as the heritage and the history of Amstetten and Linz. In 1951, at the age of 16, Josef Fritzl began his first job as a hard-working and brilliant engineer, working at the factory for several years to provide for him and his mother. By the age of 20, he had become very distinguished. He was perfectly groomed and always wearing expensive clothing. He hung out at the bars a lot and was quite the catch with the girls, even though he never dated any of them, knowing that his mother would never approve. However, during this time, he had found a different way to feel power over these women. He had started exposing himself to women, which gave him a perverse sense of control. Later, Josef admitted that he would ride his bike through the streets late at night during this time, and he would spy on women, saying that he'd done this to try and release the volcano that was growing inside of him that he had very little control over. After doing this for many years, the police finally started watching him during these late-night escapades. In 1956, Josef moved back to Amstetten, and soon afterwards, he met and married a very pretty 17-year-old girl named Rosemarie. Rosemarie was exactly what he was looking for. She was pretty, but not very educated. She was inexperienced in relationships, and she was quite vulnerable. She was exactly the opposite of him. He knew she would be perfect for the life that he had planned out for himself. Rosemarie was very submissive, so he knew that he would be able to have complete control over her. Rosemarie stayed with Josef for over 50 years, and this whole time she was totally dominated and controlled by him, and she never complained because she knew better. Josef let Rosemarie know from the very beginning that she would bear him many children during this marriage. Josef felt like having a large family would serve him more power and recognition as being a perfect family man. In 1958, Rosemarie gave birth to a baby girl. This was the first of 7 children that she gave Josef over a span of 13 years. Rosemarie's family never liked Josef. In 1959, Josef was arrested for exposing himself to women that lived in Linz. The police chief said that Josef had already racked up a record with police by this time, being arrested in Linz for exposing himself and another time for attempted rape. In 1960, Rosemarie gave birth to another baby girl. She was at this time aware of the arrest of Josef and his crimes. However, she never spoke ill of her husband, nor did she ever leave his side. Records are very few on the Fritzl family after 1960 for several years. However, Josef did say that it was during this time that he went away from his family for 3 years to work, leaving Rosemarie and the children in Amstetten. He also bragged that he did have many extramarital affairs during his time away from his family, adding that he always chose nice, good girls to sleep with, due to being very cautious of not wanting to acquire any STD, so he never chose street girls to satisfy his needs. In 1963, after Josef had returned back home, he was rehired at his former factory job in Linz, being an engineer. So he was driving to Linz daily for work. It was also this year that Rosemarie gave birth to their first son, named Harold. If Josef worked the night shift, he would not drive all the way back home. He would just spend those nights with Rosemarie's parents, who still lived in Linz. But Josef would not come straight to their home after his shift. He would not get there until daylight broke, because he would spend all of the dark hours spying on women. In April of 1966, Rosemarie gave birth to their 3rd daughter and 4th child, and they named her Elisabeth. Even though Josef had 2 other daughters, for some reason he was way more attached to Elisabeth. Even from birth, he became totally obsessed with Elisabeth when she was a toddler. He was smitten with her thick red hair and her high cheekbones. Josef later said that Elisabeth had always reminded him of his mother. When Elisabeth aged to puberty, Josef began lusting after her. To the outside world, Josef Fritzl was a very distinguished family man with well-behaved and perfect children. Everyone in the church thought of Josef and Rosemarie to be immaculate and perfect parents, but little did anyone know that behind closed doors, Josef ran his family and home like a military camp, with him being Hitler. Everyone under his roof had very strict rules that they must abide by. If his rules were ever broken, his wrath was absolute hell, as he would attack with his fist. When Elisabeth was only 4 months old, in August of 1966, a 17-year-old girl named Anna was reported missing. 3 days later, her body was found in a cornfield. She was shot twice in the head. Her brutal murder was ruled as a horribly brutal sex crime. Anna's murderer was never caught. However, 42 years later, Josef Fritzl was questioned about her murder. Chapter 3. If you scream, I will kill you. By the summer of 1967, Josef's uncontrollable sex drive was pushing him to do more risky things to satisfy his needs. There were more and more police reports being filed against him. He was hiding in the bushes and spying on women. By September of 1967, Josef turned violent, dragging a woman into the woods and attempting to rape her. Luckily, she was able to get away from him before he could, but it was only weeks later that he did allegedly rape a 20-year-old woman from Linz. This woman was so traumatized and embarrassed about what had happened to her that she never told anyone until 40 years later. Only a month after attempting to rape a 20-year-old woman, Josef climbed through a kitchen window of another woman, taking one of her own kitchen knives, wrapping it in a dishcloth, and he crept into her bedroom. This newly married 24-year-old nurse was home alone while her husband was working a night shift. Josef brutally raped her at knife point in her own bed, telling her, "If you scream, I will kill you." Even though Josef threatened to kill her if she told anyone, he was arrested 3 weeks later. Under strong interrogation, Josef admitted that he had indeed committed the exact crime the woman reported to police. The arrest was exposed to the community by the local newspaper with the headline saying, "Father of 4, vulgar sex offender, climbed through window and threatened woman with death." For this crime, Josef was sentenced to 18 months in prison. During his time in prison, Rosemarie's family begged her to take their 4 children and leave Josef, but Rosemarie would not even consider doing that. She stood by Josef the entire time he was incarcerated. Even though everyone in their town and church knew exactly what happened due to the local newspaper headline about his crimes, Rosemarie went on with her life raising her children and never once seemed to be distraught or embarrassed of her husband's crimes. At the end of 1969, Josef Fritzl was released from prison. Being that he was very knowledgeable at being an engineer, he had no problem finding another job. He was hired immediately by an Amstetten construction company. Other employees at the company was not comfortable working with Josef due to his sex offender crimes, but the company turned a blind eye to Josef's past because he was such a brilliant technician, soon giving him a promotion at the company, being the technical director of the company overseeing the development of concrete sewage pipes. This promotion and job taught Josef all he ever needed to know about pouring concrete and construction methods using concrete. Josef never talked about his family or private life with any other employees. All they knew about him was that he was married and he did have a criminal record. In 1971, Rosemarie gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, naming them Josef Jr. and Gabrielle. At this time, Josef was 36 years old. With them now having 6 children, Josef decided the family needed a bigger house, so he moved his family into his mother's 3-story home in a more upscale area of Amstetten. The home sat on the side of a very busy road with cafes and flower shops on both sides. There was even a tattoo parlor across the street. Josef told Maria's neighbors that his mother had died, but later Josef told a psychiatrist that he had locked his mother in a room upstairs, bricked in the window, and she never saw the light of day again. And she had died 9 years after Josef moved himself and his family into her home in 1980. Josef decided that his mother's large home would be a great business investment. He had the old home destroyed, and he built a much larger, fine home only yards away from where it sat. But as the old home was destroyed, he made damn sure that the old cellar that was under the home was left untouched and not damaged at all. Josef got a new job selling industrial machines throughout Austria. He was away from home for several days at a time, and he'd done extremely well in this new job. He bought a new Mercedes, and he started dressing in very expensive clothing. He was known to all as being a very successful businessman. During his days away from home, he would visit the brothels, and he developed an obsession with sadistic sexual acts and the hired women. But it got to the point that most of these workers in these brothels were too afraid to have him sent to their rooms, as he was extremely abusive during his demanded sadistic sexual demands. When Josef was at home, He was keeping his family in a state of complete terror. He ran his family as if they were a part of his own personal military boot camp, and he was their drill sergeant, even insisting that the kids refer to him as Sir. Anytime Josef entered the room, the kids were to stop whatever they were doing, no matter what it was, and stand completely still. Disobeying him was never even considered. If he even thought one of the kids may be disobeying his extreme rules and curfews, he would do to them just as his own mother had done to him, beat them until they were black and blue. Rosemarie also was not excluded from Josef's extreme rules, and she was in constant fear for her own life when he was at home. Josef also beat her unmercifully. He would also constantly belittle and dominate her in public. She would only hang her head and walk by his side, and she never talked back. In 1973, 33-year-old Rosemarie gave birth to their seventh and last child. By this time, most people had forgotten about Josef's terrible past, and he was considered to be a prominent member of the Catholic Church and the community. The perfect image of a good Catholic father, he was well respected as a wonderful disciplinarian to his children that were perfectly behaved. During this time, old school discipline, or physical punishment to children, was well respected and considered good parenting skills in order to raise future model citizens. Josef bought a campsite in a hotel located 92 miles away from Amstetten on Monsey Lake at a well-known tourist resort that was nearby the church where the famous wedding was shot in the film The Sound of Music. He had quit his sales job and decided to go full-time into property development. He made Rosemarie run the guest house, which he had named Z-Stem Starfish. Josef done all of the landscaping at the campsite himself, as well as the renovating of the inn and the guest house. The locals around the lake area were very impressed with Josef and him being such a professional man. His campsite was immaculate, perfect lawns, and beautiful flower beds. Every summer, Josef would stay at their home in Amstetten with the 7 children, and Rosemarie was ordered to stay and run the guest house at the lake. This arrangement was actually something that Rosemarie loved. Josef told Rosemarie that he had no more use for her sexually because she had gained way too much weight and he was not attracted to her at all anymore. But Josef was not finished having children himself, though. Oh no, he had already decided who his next wife was going to be, and he would start a whole new second family with her. In 1974, there was a fire at the guest house. The investigation led to the fire possibly being arson. Josef was brought into the police department for questioning. He was released as there was not enough evidence to charge him. Over the next few years, there was many more suspicious fires at his campsite property. Josef collected thousands of dollars in insurance claims. Chapter 4. Elisabeth. In 1977, Elisabeth started middle school. Later, she told police that her father had first begun messing with her just after her 11th birthday and before she began puberty. This traumatized her to the point that she never told anyone. She learned to keep her mouth shut and keep her terrible secret to herself and to deal with this pain both physically and mentally. And even today, almost 4 decades later, Elisabeth still cannot talk about the painful memory of her first time of her father touching her, saying that she was just a scared little 11-year-old girl. After the first time, her father then began the years of long sexual abuse of her, taking her forcefully at any time he felt the urge. During this time, Josef was flipping houses in the real estate business in Lower Austria, staying at home and caring for the kids while having Rosemarie far away running the campsite and guest house. During the summer break of 1977, Rosemarie went away all summer for an Italian vacation. she took all of the kids with her except for Elisabeth. And this is because Josef insisted that Elisabeth stay home with him that summer. Years later, Elisabeth said that was the summer that the SA escalated hugely. In the cellar, in her father's car, and even in the woods, when her father would make her go on walks with him. For many years, Elisabeth was way too embarrassed to tell anyone about what her father was doing to her. But she did eventually confide in a few of her closest friends when she got older. After Elisabeth matured more as a teenager, Josef became very possessive of her. She was not allowed to ever speak to boys and ordered to come directly home after school. A former classmate says that she remembers when they would visit Elisabeth at her house, they would have to leave the very moment that her father got home, adding that Elisabeth would be beat by her father if she ever put on any makeup or wore any sort of clothing that he deemed provocative. All of the years of SA her father had done to her turned her from being a social butterfly into a very timid and withdrawn introvert. A friend of the family said that he remembered Elisabeth was the one child out of all of them that Josef was extreme with his discipline, saying that he witnessed Josef beating her terribly. Elisabeth would be slapped by Josef and beaten for things that the other kids would only be a little bit scolded for, adding that he also noticed whenever they were out together for dinner that Josef would be a fun, charismatic guy with a good sense of humor. But as soon as he returned home to his family, he turned straight into a drill sergeant again. He was like two totally different people in one body. By this time, Josef was demanding that Elisabeth be his own personal property. In 1978, when Elisabeth was only 12 years old, Josef started making plans to turn the cellar into a secret chamber to lock Elisabeth away from the world in, so she would then be his and only his, and be his own personal sex slave. His visions of his secret torture chamber took him another 6 years to fully complete to his liking. Even though he was still hiring sex workers, most of them would not come to his calls because of his sick and twisted, cruel demands. He started drawing up the blueprints of how he was going to design and build the underground prison around the old cellar. He also decided to go ahead and add on 8 tiny rooms to the back of his own home and rent those out for extra money. Doing this not only would give him extra income from the renters, but also from the government. He could apply for grants for the money to build it all on, fronting like he was going to be building them to help house immigrants from the Cold War. That summer, he submitted his applications for the grant money and he began his projects. The book explains exactly how his plans were, with the ventilation system, the electricity, the plumbing, soundproofing, sewage system, etc., etc. Josef put a lot of thought into his designing of this prison that he would put his daughter in, so he could have her to himself and start a whole new family with her. On Halloween Day in 1978, Josef was granted permission by the Amstetten Council to build a 24-square-yard underground nuclear shelter. This is much smaller than what he had planned to build. But over the next 6 years, he dug and removed over 250 tons of dirt. Then, using his knowledge, he poured concrete into the dugout ground, forming the floors, walls, and ceilings of his secret prison. During the next 6 years of Josef working long hours building the dungeon underneath his home, while construction was going, his wife and kids were inside the home above him, never knowing what Josef was doing or building beneath them, nor did they dare even ask. Making sure that there would be no neighbors that would see anything, he planted shrubs and greenery all around his home, making a fence of greenery around his garden. Even while Josef was spending these 6 years building Elisabeth's prison underneath his home, he also continued to mess with Elisabeth. By now, she was forming into a gorgeous teenage girl. This was really frustrating Josef. He was becoming very possessive of her, and he was worried that boys in her classes at middle school may start to have an interest in her. Elisabeth dressed very poor and unkempt, even though her father dressed very successful and extravagant, wearing very expensive suits and shoes and driving expensive, classy cars. One of Elisabeth's middle school friends named Krista said that she would come to school on Monday with her clothes clean, but she would wear the same outfit to school every day, and by Friday, that outfit, after a week, was dirty and unkempt. Even though Krista and her twin sister also had a hard home life, she had no clue about the horrors that Elisabeth was going through at her home. Elisabeth was very close with the 11-year-old twins during middle school. The twins later said that they had met Elisabeth's mother a few times and she was very nice, but they had never met her father, Josef. All they knew about him was that Elisabeth said that he was very strict. That was really about it. She never talked about her father at all, other than saying that. They had all walked home together after school, but Elisabeth had to be home no later than 30 minutes after school was out. Chapter 5. The Pig Will Beat Us to Death One Day. Even though Josef's family was struggling financially during the mid-1980s, Josef was still making a few trips each week to Linz, hiring hookers from the brothels where prostitution is legal, taking elegant Mediterranean vacations, and keeping up well with his fake persona of being a successful businessman to the outside world. Josef was well known at the high-end brothels with the Eastern girls with a minimum price of $250 an hour. He had been a regular there since the 1970s. He was well known for wanting his hired girls to perform bizarre and sadistic acts for him, including but not limited to them playing like they were a corpse, while he pleasured himself over their imaginary dead bodies. Many of these sex workers at the brothels were so incredibly disgusted at his demands that they would refuse his business, and this was extremely unusual for the workers there. They would say that Josef would torture the girls to the near brink of death. He would scream at the girls, saying, "I want to see you smothering to the point of death, and only then will I let you be free." The owner of one of the brothels later said Josef would not come to orgasm unless he had the complete power over his victim's life and death. He had a godlike complex and had to torture in order to be sexually satisfied. He was actually more aroused by the torture and the humiliation that he put onto the girls than he was about the sex. In the early 1980s, Josef started buying real estate properties as well as running a mail-order lingerie business. He purchased 5 houses, one being less than 2 miles from his own home. He also started frequenting bars quite regularly, always making sure that his appearance was top-notch, presenting himself as a very successful and wealthy businessman, shaving his mustache and dressing in trendy and expensive Italian business suits. Even though Josef outwardly appeared to be this outgoing and transparent guy to the outside world, inside he was worried that he was losing control of Elisabeth as she was growing into a very attractive young lady. Another classmate said in an interview for a magazine, all of the Fritzl children were terrified of their dad, and he did not just discipline them by spanking or grounding them. Their dad would beat them with his fist. Her brother once said, "The pig will beat us all to death one day." One of the brothers was so terrified of Josef that whenever he would hear Josef turning the key, unlocking the door to come into the house, he would run and hide in the corner and wet his pants. A friend of the family witnessed Josef's cruel abuse one time, saying that Josef flew into a rage, and she watched on in total shock as Josef drug his small daughter out of the vehicle by her hair while he was slapping her hard with his open hands right on her face as she continued to cry. Later on, she talked to Rosemarie about what she had seen. Rosemarie only said that it was nothing unusual about what she had seen. It was very normal discipline of the children by their father. She also asked Rosemarie why it seemed like Josef favored some of the kids and hated the others. Rosemary did not even have an answer for that other than Josef only respected their oldest daughter above all of the others because she had stood up to him and talked back to him, and the other kids would never even think about standing up to their father at all. Rosemary did confide to her that she honestly hated the bastard and was happy only when he was not at home, and they had not been intimate with each other in a very long time. But she was happy that he was not touching her anymore. Most of the time, Elisabeth would not even dress out for PE at school, due to her being embarrassed from being covered in bruises and being beaten by her father. Elisabeth never told anyone the truth about why she would not dress out at PE. Other classmates later rented a room from Josef in the Fritzl home. He said Elisabeth was always polite in school, but she was very shy and rarely ever spoke to anyone. She really had to get to know you before she would even talk to you. 15-year-old Elisabeth left Amstetten Technical Middle School in the summer of 1981. She really wanted to join her friends in taking a trade. She wanted to be a cosmetologist, but Josef would have none of that. He demanded that she would work at the guest house at his campsite. Her only real friends, the twins, said that the last time they ever saw her was the last day of school in that summer of 1981. That was the same summer that Josef got Elisabeth a job at a diner owned by some of the people that he knew. She was a cook and a waitress. Elisabeth would remain at this job for 3 years. Josef knew that Elisabeth would need this type of training for her unbeknownst future, as she would need to know how to prepare meals for him when he had her dungeon completed. There was the requirement, though, that she had to attend a tech college that was 100 miles away from Amstetten. She had to complete a 2-month initiation course. Josef was not happy about her having to share a dorm room with other female students taking this course, but he really had no choice and had to allow it. Elisabeth was so happy she honestly thought that her father was allowing her to have freedom away from him and was now going to allow her to live her own life. While she was at the college, she made several good friends and even mustered up the courage to trust a couple of them enough to confide in them about Josef's abuse. One of those confidants later said that Elisabeth was so afraid of her father and how she always wanted to run away. When Elisabeth completed that 2-month course at the college, she returned home and, of course, the abuse continued. She worked at the diner and became close with some of her fellow employees there and even started going out with them to nightclubs after work. In 1982, the statute of limitations of Josef's prior rape conviction was expunged, which left him with a pristine criminal record. Shortly after that, Josef was arrested for arson, and this was due to yet again another suspicious fire at his Monsey Lake guest house. He was booked and put into prison for only a short while. He was released because of lack of any evidence against him. Many people were convinced that Josef set all of these suspicious fires that he collected insurance money on at the guest house and campground that he owned, because they always seemed to happen when he was having financial problems. At any rate, he was never convicted, so he walked out of the prison with a totally clean slate and no criminal record whatsoever, appearing as any other upstanding citizen that had never had any prior run-ins with the law. Chapter 6. Escape. On January the 28th of 1983, Elisabeth and a coworker, both 17 years old, went to a bar after work. After they had consumed a few drinks, Elisabeth got very emotional, crying as she confessed to her coworker that her life at home was pure hell, and she had to get away from it, going on to admit that her dad had been raping her since she was 11 years old. It was that night that they both made a plan to run away together. Elisabeth and a friend went away to Vence, which is a large city, and they would blend in easier and have less of a chance of being caught. They found and rented a cheap apartment there, and they went into hiding. This was not long before Josef noticed her missing, and he was furious. He reported her missing and immediately started searching for her. 3 weeks later, Elisabeth and her friend were found at a party. Neighbors at the apartment complex had called in complaints to the police about the party being too loud, and Elisabeth and her friend were immediately recognized as the missing runaway teens. The girls were picked up and taken to the police department. Police called Josef to let him know that his daughter had been found and was being held at the police department until he came to take her back home, which he did the very next morning. Josef was absolutely fuming mad, demanding that she never be around her friend again, and Rosemary would also make certain that she was never to be anywhere near her friend. Josef then started referring to Elisabeth to everyone as the black sheep, telling them that she was an alcohol and drug abuser. Unbeknownst to Elisabeth, because she ran away and being found at an open house party under the influence, this would later give Josef the absolute perfect ammunition to use to the outside world as to why she would suddenly disappear very soon and without a trace. And now she had a history of running away as well as using alcohol and living recklessly and wild. The essay continued after Elisabeth went back home. By this point, it was just easier for Elisabeth just to give in to her father without a fuss. It never stopped him anyway, and it only escalated his beatings when she tried to fight back. That summer, when Elisabeth was back at her dorm, she got a job being a waitress at a hotel, and even though she appeared to be stunning on the outside, her colleagues remembered her as being a very troubled alcoholic. They referred to her by the nickname of Sissy. One of her former co-workers said in an interview, "Sissy was the wildest party girl I had ever met, always sneaking out of the dorm room at night to meet up with guys, and she would stay out all night, drinking, dancing, partying, and then she would barely work at all the next day. She partied hard, and she could drink more alcohol than anyone I had ever seen." At one point, their boss was fed up with her coming into work hungover and not performing her duties, and he threatened to fire her and send her back home. Elisabeth had a complete meltdown when her boss told her this, and she said, "No, please don't. If I have to go back there, I will run away. I cannot stand to be there." Elisabeth stopped drinking and going out after that. She completed her course and returned to Amstetten and took her old job back at the diner. In the fall of 1983, Josef had almost completed the Cellar prison, having been working on it almost daily, single-handedly, for the last 6 years. He was now bringing in appliances and furnishings such as a refrigerator and a stove, as well as a toilet, and installing them into the dungeon prison. He even installed a gas furnace to burn trash, as well as lining the walls and ceiling with miscellaneous items, including corkboard, to make certain the prison would be absolutely soundproof and nothing would be able to be heard from inside of the dungeon walls in the home above them or from the outside. Later, Josef even bragged about how smart he was when he built the dungeon, saying, "I got a heavy concrete motorized door that worked by remote control to go in and out of the cellar. It needed a number code to open and close," adding proudly that he added a bed, electricity, lights, and even a way to cook, saying that it was possible that some neighbors could have seen him working on the cellar, building it throughout the 6 years. But it was none of their business what I was doing with my own castle, and they knew not to ask questions about my business, and yes, that included my wife, children, and the tenants. In July of 1983, inspectors came out to the home, and Josef led them down to the dungeon that he referred to as a fallout shelter. Inspectors were very impressed with the construction and fully agreed to give his impressive nuclear shelter a stamp of approval for a large state grant to pay for the construction of his masterpiece. Josef had kept all of the receipts and every cent that he had paid to build his daughter's future prison. On April the 16th, 1984, Elisabeth turned 18 years old. She was so excited and hopeful for her future. planning to move in with her oldest sister after she completed her 3-year college courses. This birthday brought Elisabeth more hope and more excitement than any birthday she had ever had in her life. Freedom and liberation were now so close. A few months before she turned 18, she had moved out of her father's house and was now living in an apartment with some friends and was working towards giving herself a new and more mature look. She even went and had her hair cut into a page boy style. But with this new look and new friends, she also slipped back into her old escape method, and that was going out to bars and drinking to numb her painful memories. Elisabeth had also met a guy from one of her classes that she had gotten very close to. But after the class was completed, he moved away, and this left Elisabeth very heartbroken. Just a few months before Elisabeth finished her final classes, she received a note from one of her former colleagues and friends. Elisabeth had confided in him about the abuse and everything that her father had done to her. His letter to her was lengthy and very caring, wondering about how she was doing, and Elisabeth replied to his letter on May the 9th, 1984. She told him in the letter that she was doing fine at the moment, although she was very stressed out and did still have pains from time to time, adding that she was still in contact with only one other person from their classes, this being the guy that she was seeing and had moved away, and her heart was now broken. She went on to tell him of her plans of the future after she got her courses completed, and how she was going to move in with her sister, and she promised him that she would send him her new address once she was there with her sister and settled in. She even invited him to come and visit her once she got there. After this letter, Elisabeth wrote to him again while she was hungover from one of her prior nights of partying. She wrote that it was already after 10 a.m. and she was still lying in her bed trying to recover from last night's partying, telling him how hammered she got, and saying that afterwards everyone came back to her apartment to crash. She signed the letter with only an S, telling him to stay safe, be good, and don't drink too much. Meanwhile, Josef was in the background, looking from the outside in and seeing all of the partying and going out that Elisabeth was doing. He was biting his tongue, even though it was making him furious that she was seeing other boys and being wild. He was also glad that she was engaging in this behavior and how so many others were seeing this as well, because her behavior right now was going to make it so much easier to explain away her disappearance very soon, as he was very near completion of Elisabeth's new home. The last and final touch to the prison was installing the large steel 2-foot by 3-foot door into the door case. After installing this door, he finished it by spraying it completely with liquid concrete. After it was dried and completed, this door weighed 660 pounds, and it completely sealed off his prison from the unknowing outside world. Now, finally, his secret prison was complete and ready for his prisoner. Chapter 7. Brief Encounter. Elisabeth was nearing her final exams and already had an open invitation of employment at an upscale business in Linz if she passed her exams with good marks. She had to go take a final 2-month course before taking her main finals. During these 2 months, she met an aspiring 18-year-old cook named Andres. He was smitten by Elisabeth and started conversating with her. It did not take long after meeting that the two started dating, and they quickly fell in love. The college was very strict about their boys and girls not being together, so even though Elisabeth and Andres was a couple, it was hard for the two to have any sort of physical relationship due to this very strict rule. They would sneak off and go into the woods and meet up and spend hours together making out and also just talking and telling each other about their own lives. They were never intimate, though. Elisabeth would always pull away any time she felt like they were getting too close. She was very shy, and the trauma from her father had never left her mind. Elisabeth told him about the unhappiness in her life at home, as well as confiding in him that she had ran away from home when she was only 14, and that she had stayed with one of her sisters much of the time because of the pressures at home, and how extremely controlling and strict her father was. As Elisabeth and Andre's course was ending, they contemplated running away together and getting married after their exams. Andreas later said that they were madly in love. On the last night of being at the school and after their exams, there was a class party. Elisabeth was very emotional and upset that she had failed one of the very important exams. She was worried that this failed exam would eliminate her from being able to be hired at the job that she was so looking forward to in Linz. Very early the next morning, Josef and Marie arrived at the school to pick up Elisabeth and take her back home. She told Andres goodbye, and she promised to keep in touch with him through letters until they could be together again. Later, Andres said when Elisabeth left, he kissed her goodbye, and they made a promise to each other to keep in touch through letters, and they would be back together soon. He went on to add that he was not able to walk her to her parents' car because she said that her father would see him and he would be furious if he knew that she was seeing someone. Andres said he watched out the dorm window as Elisabeth stepped into her family's car and drove away, never to see her again. After Elisabeth's return home, Josef had become more possessive and abusive to her than he was ever in the past, not even allowing her to walk out of the house unless it was just to go to work for her shift at the cafe. Elisabeth was missing Andres so much, and she was wondering why he was not writing her letters like he had promised her that he would do. But Andres did send Elisabeth 2 very lengthy and personal love letters. He spilled his heart out to her, telling her that he was so much in love with her and how excited he was about their plans to elope and their futures together after marriage and having children. Elisabeth would never read these letters, as Josef got them first and read them himself, and he became absolutely furious with jealous rage that Elisabeth was seeing another man behind his back. This is something that Josef was not going to tolerate, another man touching her body. So he decided that now was the time to put Elisabeth into her newly built prison home, so she would be his own personal property forevermore. Chapter 8. Taken. On Tuesday, August the 8th, 1984, just before 9 a.m., Elisabeth was getting ready to go to her scheduled shift to work at the cafe when Josef walked into her room and asked her if she would help him to bring a heavy door down into the basement. Elisabeth followed her father down 3 flights of stairs to the basement and down to the cellar. Once they reached the entrance into the cellar, Josef asked her to help him pull the 600-pound door into position to seal off the cellar. As Elisabeth walked through the threshold of the cellar, Josef grabbed the back of her head by her hair with one hand, and with his other hand, he put a ether-soaked rag over her nose and mouth. Elisabeth fought back with everything that she had to no avail. Elisabeth lost consciousness. Josef handcuffed her and drug her through a long, man-made tunnel through 7 different doors and into the prison dungeon, throwing her onto a little bed, and he began to savagely rape her over and over and over. When he was finished with her, he turned off the lights and he left, locking each of the 8 doors as he walked through the tunnel back to the basement. This would be the first of 8,516 days before Elisabeth would ever see the light of day again. Later, when Elisabeth came to from the ether-induced coma that her father had put her into, she was in total darkness, and her hands were cuffed to a small bed. After what seemed like days, Elisabeth heard the door being open. Josef turned on the light and walked over to her. Pushing her back onto the bed, he began raping her over and over like some sort of crazed animal, raping, torturing, and beating her sadistically Then, cuffing her to the wall, he left the dungeon. Elisabeth noticed that he had left her a bowl of food on the floor by where she was chained. She screamed as loud as she could until her voice was almost gone. She was kicking and beating the walls, but Josef had worked very hard to totally soundproof all of the walls and the ceiling in the dungeon, so no one would ever hear her screams at all. It was another 2 days before Josef returned. He brought more food and, of course, raped her again. Elisabeth tried so hard to fight her father off. Josef beat her horribly for her resistance of him. Eventually, Elisabeth knew there was no use in trying to resist her father's sexual demands. So she just gave up and gave in to him, knowing that she had no other choice. When Josef was finished with her, he tied an electric cable around her waist. The cable was only 2 yards long. This allowed her only enough distance to a small makeshift toilet that he had installed in the corner of the small dungeon. He also attached a chain around her stomach. She lived her life like this for the next year, with nothing to do in her prison except walk to the small toilet and waiting on her father to bring her a bowl of food, and know she would have to give in to his sadistic and twisted sexual rape and torture. She had learned not to even try to fight him off, because she was not able to, and her resistance of him would only cause him to beat her unmercifully, and left her sitting in her prison with the wounds and bruises constantly hurting. The first night Elisabeth did not return home, her mother was so worried about her. But Josef comforted Rosemarie all night as she waited for Elisabeth to come home. He tried to console Rosemarie by telling her that Elisabeth probably just ran away from home again. When Elisabeth never came home, the next morning Josef and Rosemarie went to the police station and promptly reported their daughter Elisabeth as missing. Josef made sure and let the police know that Elisabeth had a history of running away in the past, and he assumed that she had most likely done this time as well. Over the next week, Josef went through all of the expected motions of a father that was concerned that his child was missing, talking to people in town and asking if they may have seen her, going to her job and talking to her boss and coworkers, asking if she had said anything to them about running away or leaving, but of course, no one knew anything. Josef and Rosemarie visited businesses, bars, train stations, asking everyone if they had seen her, while Josef also made it clear that she was a repeat runaway and she did frequent the bars. Meanwhile, Elisabeth was still chained and weak, almost lethargic, in the very poorly ventilated dungeon. Josef was going into the dungeon several times a day to take advantage of Elisabeth and throw her scraps of food from his leftover meals. If she ever tried to resist him, he would not only beat her, but he would also take these scraps of food back with him. So she stopped resisting him just altogether, just to keep from starving to death and being beaten to death. Elisabeth had no idea if it was day or night, nor when a day had even passed. All she knew was when she heard the door locks being opened and her father was entering to satisfy his twisted needs and to throw her some scraps of food. Andres continued to write Elisabeth, but he never got any replies or return letters, which was frustrating to him. Eventually, he just decided to call her home. Josef answered the phone and told him that Elisabeth was not there and don't ever call back again. September the 21st, 1984, after Josef had forced himself onto Elisabeth and satisfied himself, he gave her a pen and a paper and told her to write down what he says. The letter explained that Elisabeth did not want to be found and told her parents not to look for her, as she was fine and happy and wanted to live her own life. Josef then presented her with an envelope to address to him at their home above the prison dungeon. Josef took this letter and he drove over 100 miles to the town where Adolf Hitler was born and he mailed the letter from the post office there. A few days later, when the letter arrived at the Fritzl home, Rosemary was relieved to hear that Elisabeth was okay and she just wanted to be left alone. Josef then took the letter to the police department to let them know that he was right all along and that Elisabeth had run away from home. He then went to the local newspaper and asked them to run a story about his missing daughter, and he gave them a photo of Elisabeth to add to the story. Friends of the Fritzls felt so terrible for Josef and Rosemary, as Josef had shown the letter to almost everyone that would look at it, to let them know that it was no use in even searching for Elisabeth any longer, as she had run away and joined a cult. Everyone was so empathetic for Josef and Rosemary because Elisabeth had caused them so much grief and heartache. When the word had gotten around to Elisabeth's friends and co-workers, they really were not surprised to hear that she had run off with a cult, as she had confided in several of them that she had had enough of her life at home and she would probably run away again someday. But some of her friends did wonder why the police never talked to any of them at all, to ask them if they knew why Elisabeth would run away from home over and over again. Chapter 9. His second wife. A couple of weeks after Josef had shown the letter to the police as proof that Elisabeth had indeed run away again, he was making trip after trip to the police station, constantly complaining to them that they were not doing enough to help him find his daughter, just to make it appear that he was a father in distress over his missing child. Over the next few years, Josef and Rosemary would give many interviews with newspapers, radio, and television, pleading for the public's help to bring Elisabeth home. Rosemary continued raising her other children in their home, totally unaware that her daughter, Elisabeth, was being held like a caged animal, 3 floors below the home, with hardly enough air in the poorly ventilated prison to breathe. April the 16th, 1985. Elisabeth turned 19 years old. At this point, under the Austrian laws, Elisabeth was no longer a minor, so she was free to live and do whatever she pleased. So the search for her was called off. In celebration of her birthday, Josef removed the electric cable from around her waist. Now, she would be able to walk around inside the small prison dungeon. Later, a psychologist would say that Elisabeth was a classic case of Stockholm Syndrome. This is a condition to where the victim becomes sympathetic towards their abuser, giving in to their controlling actions and demands as a way to survive in the beginning, and then it turns into empathy for their abuser, eventually normalizing the victim's treatment by the abuser to keep from going insane. Josef started bringing Elisabeth small gifts when he would make his every other day visits to the prison to rape her. These gifts would be things like warm food, a blanket, socks, maybe a little article of clothing. He had stopped beating her by now, and she was not resisting him any longer. Josef was now looking at Elisabeth as his beautiful new wife, and not his out-of-control daughter. In an interview in 2008, Josef was adamant that he had never had sexual relations with Elisabeth until she was 18, saying, quote, "The pressure to do the forbidden was just too much to withstand, so one night I went down into the cellar and I laid her down on the bed, and I had sex with her." He went on to claim that Elisabeth did not try to push him away or fight him off. All she did was lay there and make small whimpering noises, adding that after they had sex, he would sit with her and she ate her food, and they would chat a bit about how her brothers and sisters upstairs were doing and how much her mother missed her. Each time he left the dungeon, he would always remind her that there were traps on the door, and if she tried to open it and escape, that lethal gases would be immediately released into the dungeon, and it would kill her within seconds. Josef had 8 rooms in his home that he rented out to tenants. He had a set of very strict rules that they had to agree to and sign to before he would rent to them. One of these rules being they were never allowed to go into the basement, as that was his office, and he kept all of his files and paperwork in there. They were also not allowed to go into his garden or take photos outside of the garden. Over the years, Josef had rented to over 100 different tenants, including one that had attended a college class with Elisabeth. Some of the tenants did say later that they did indeed hear strange noises and what sounded like screams that came from the cellar, but they never told anyone or made a fuss about it, as they did not want to upset Josef and be kicked out of their room. So they kept quiet and they stayed to themselves. Eventually, Josef got more comfortable with letting Rosemarie know that he was going into his basement office, and he would stay there for long hours, even spending the night down there many nights, and he would tell Rosemarie that he was working late in his office preparing blueprints. Rosemarie later said that she and the children had strict orders to never go down there. She added that she was not even allowed to bring him a cup of coffee, and no one would ever dare ask him why they were not allowed, as Josef's rules were not made to be questioned, ever. Rosemarie had fell into a deep depression and gained a lot of weight. Josef would not touch her at all, telling her and their friends that, quote, "chubby women are below my standards," end quote. In September 1986, Elisabeth learned that she was pregnant, and this set her into a very deep depression. At 10 weeks into her pregnancy, she miscarried the baby, causing her to consider taking her own life. When Josef came to take the fetus away, he showed no sympathy whatsoever. Instead, he turned off the lights as a form of punishment to her. November the 12th, 1986. 2 divers found the body of a 17-year-old girl who had been found at the bottom of a lake near Josef's lake house. A friend of Josef's later said that Josef was staying there at his lake house the day this girl had disappeared. The young girl, who had a striking resemblance to Elisabeth, had disappeared only 10 days earlier. It was not until 22 years later that Josef Fritzl was investigated for her murder. But by this time, Josef was a very distinguished businessman, dressing very high maintenance and driving luxury cars. He was then in his early 50s, and because his hair was thinning on top, he had traveled to have a very expensive hair transplant. In 1987, Josef went on a vacation with a friend to Thailand to a ritzy sex resort. Before he left, he did pack up Elisabeth's refrigerator with food and drink so she could feed herself while he was gone. Chapter 10. Children of the Cellar. In 1988, 4 years of living in the dungeon prison, Elisabeth was now 22 years old. She became pregnant for the second time, and she was terrified to tell her father, but she did eventually have to tell him. Josef started bringing Elisabeth books to study on pregnancy and how to deliver a baby. From that point on, Josef and Elisabeth's relationship changed. Instead of it being like a jailer and a prisoner, it was more like a twisted form of husband and wife. When Elisabeth became very noticeably pregnant, Josef stopped having sex with her, possibly because she was no longer attractive to him due to her belly size. So he abandoned her so she could deliver her baby in the dungeon alone. Elisabeth did manage to deliver her own healthy baby girl and cut the umbilical cord herself. She named her new baby Kirsten. The baby gave Elisabeth a reason to live and to survive. She wrote down Kirsten's date of birth and she hid it. When Kirsten was 10 days old, Josef came to see his new granddaughter. He informed Elisabeth that Kirsten was the beginning of their new family, and he would be giving her more children throughout the following years. Although Kirsten seemed to be born healthy, she was very sick. She suffered with stomach cramps as well as epilepsy and screaming fits. Elisabeth nursed Kirsten and was the very best mother that she could be to her, given the circumstances of living in the small one-room, unsanitary dungeon prison. Josef resumed his raping of Elisabeth. Now he was raping her right in front of Kirsten. Josef was also having to drive long distances to buy diapers and baby formula. He could not be seen anywhere in Amstetten purchasing these kind of items. When Kirsten was 2 months old, Elisabeth became pregnant again. And again, she went into labor and delivered a baby boy by herself in late 1989. She named him Stefan, and again wrote his date of birth on a scrap piece of paper and hid it away. Even though Josef was staying very busy between both of his families, he made sure and take the time to make visits to the brothels of Linz. As his children at home grew up and aged into adult, they would move away from home to get away from him and his strict and controlling rules. Soon enough, the only child left at home was their youngest son, Josef Jr., who had learning disabilities. Josef used him as a personal servant and only allowed him to leave the house 1 time a week. In the latter part of 1991, Elisabeth became pregnant for the 4th time. In August of 1982, she delivered a baby girl that she named Lisa. Elisabeth begged her father for more room in the small prison. In 1993, Josef started his reconstruction of the dungeon to extend it on out into the original cellar of the old house, even constructing a small padded and sealed room to take Elisabeth in to rape her so that the children could not watch. Josef had no plans of digging it out himself, though, so he ordered Elisabeth and the children to do the digging themselves, using nothing but their bare hands. This took them almost a decade to complete. For 10 years, Elisabeth and the children spent most all of their awakened hours digging this tunnel with their hands, and every few days Josef would come and remove the dirt with the wheelbarrow and dispose of it in the garden. Those 10 years of digging was hard, with little air in the dungeon, and in the summer months it was almost unbearable. A few months after Lisa's birth, Josef found out that he could get a large state grant if he adopted a child, so he decided that he would take Lisa upstairs and raise her there with Rosemarie. He came up with the perfect plan to bring Lisa upstairs and into the home and raise her there, so he could also collect the money on the large state adoption grant. Chapter 11. The Foundlings. On May the 19th in 1993, Josef told Elisabeth that he would be taking Lisa upstairs for him and Rosemarie to raise. He handed Elisabeth a pen and paper and told her what to write. Elisabeth was very heartbroken that Josef would be taking away her new baby. She had grown a very close bond with Lisa while breastfeeding her, just as she had her other children. Lisa only weighed 12 pounds, and she was a bit sickly, but Josef did not care. He demanded Lisa to not question him and to write the note. So Elisabeth wrote, "Dear parents, you will probably be shocked to hear from me after all of these years, and with a real live surprise no less. I am leaving you my little daughter. Her name is Lisa. Please take good care of her." She went on to write that she was still living in the cult and she had 2 other children, another daughter and a son. But the cult would not approve of her having more children there than the 2 she already had. She added that she had breastfed Lisa for the first 6.5 months of her life, but now she does drink from a bottle and she will eat from a spoon. I am doing well, and ask that you do not try and look for me, as it's going to do you no good. I am very happy where I am. Elisabeth. Josef allowed Elisabeth and the other 2 kids to give Lisa a goodbye kiss. He then placed her in a small cardboard box. He brought the box into the house and showed it to Rosemarie, telling her that he had found it on the front doorstep. He read the letter to Rosemarie and told her that Elisabeth must have dropped the baby off during the night and just took off. Josef took the letter as well as some of Elisabeth's old school books to the police department. He asked that a handwriting expert compare the writing in the letter to Elisabeth's handwriting from the school books, even going as far as asking for a DNA test on the baby to make sure the baby really did belong to Elisabeth, as he and Rosemarie would at that point adopt their grandchild and raise her. Less than a week later, Rosemarie and Josef was granted temporary custody by the courts of little Lisa, while awaiting the long process of the legal adoption. Social workers made 20-plus visits to the Fritzl home over the next few years, always noting that Lisa was being taken very good care of by her grandparents and was in a very loving and nurturing home. Side notes in the reports were occasionally made about Josef not being present during most all of these visits. On May the 20th, 1994, 1 year and a day after Lisa had been taken from her mother by Josef and brought upstairs, Josef and Rosemarie officially adopted Lisa. The adoption also gave Josef a benefit of $23 a day for child benefits, as well as $230 a month more for family benefits. Adopting Lisa was nothing more than a moneymaker for Josef, and it gave him more motivation to take more of Lisa's future babies upstairs and adopt them, while it also made it appear to everyone that he and Rosemarie were very caring and loving grandparents. Later, he learned that if he had not actually adopted Lisa and agreed to only foster her, he would have been entitled to $1,500 a month instead of $230. This mistake Josef would not make again. Lisa was underweight when Josef brought her upstairs. She was pale and sickly from never being in the sunlight in her life. Rosemarie was ecstatic about having a new baby in the home. She just adored little Lisa, and she nurtured her. Soon, she was putting on weight, and she was thriving wonderfully. Rosemarie was frequently seen pushing Lisa in a stroller up the street so Lisa could enjoy the sunlight and fresh air. She was proud to show off her new granddaughter, and she would tell everyone that asked how she and Josef had adopted Lisa after their daughter, Elisabeth, had abandoned her on their doorstep as just an infant. Elisabeth had now been in the dungeon for 10 years. She was weak and suffering from many vitamin deficiencies and anemia, which was causing her teeth to deteriorate, and they were all falling out. The only food that Josef brought to them was canned or packaged foods. There were never fresh fruits or vegetables. However, it was not her own health that she was most concerned about. It was her 5- and 6-year-old kids, as she knew that they were also suffering from deficiencies and anemia, as well as rickets possibly, due to never seeing the sun or breathing a breath of fresh air in their entire lives. She asked Josef if he would please bring them some vitamin D supplements and maybe a UV light. Josef scoffed at her request of the vitamins and the light, but eventually he did bring them to her for the children. Finally, in 1993, Elisabeth and the kids finished digging further into the tunnel to the old cellar. Josef had brought in a twin-size bed and placed it in a sealed, padded room at the very end of the tunnel. This larger bed and private room would make it easier and much more convenient for him to take Elisabeth into so that he could rape her without the children watching. As they were now getting older, and Elisabeth felt so very uncomfortable being raped by her father right in front of her children, Josef also brought a TV into the new larger prison dungeon, and he would watch TV with the kids while Elisabeth prepared him a meal after he had raped her. Elisabeth did the best she could at homeschooling her children as they became of learning age. She knew that even though they lived in such deplorable and dysfunctional circumstances, that it was very important that they knew how to read and write and know at least basic math. She never told the children that the world that they lived in was different from everyone else's world. She wanted them to believe that everyone lived the same way as they did, in a dungeon somewhere. Even though she would occasionally talk about the life that she once lived upstairs, she would try to explain to the kids what sunshine looked like and how it would feel on your body, what rain sounded like, the smell of it, and when it hit the ground on a summer's day. In June of 1993, Elisabeth became pregnant for the 5th time. When Josef found out, he left for almost a month, going on yet another glamorous vacation to Thailand. This was thousands of miles away. Josef was now hiring both male and female prostitutes while he was away on these extended vacations. While he was enjoying sailing and lounging in the sun with his hired servants, Elisabeth was terrified that something may happen to him while he was away, and she and the children would be left to starve to death in the dungeon, as no one besides Josef knew they were down there. It was only during these times that it was a relief to Elisabeth to hear the familiar sound of the concrete door locks being turned and opened. Josef would bring Elisabeth and the kids gifts from his vacation. March 1994. Elisabeth delivered another beautiful baby girl. This time she had help with the baby's delivery and did not have to do it all by herself. Her children, Kirsten and Stefan, assisted her in this delivery. She named this baby Monica. Stefan and Kirsten were so happy to have the new baby join their little family in the dungeon, and they all took time about having Elisabeth take care of their new baby sister. Some days, Josef did not feel like driving an hour away to buy the packaged foods to bring down to the secret family in the dungeon. He could not purchase such items as these locally, as he was well known to almost everyone in their town, and he did not want anyone questioning him of why he was buying these survival-type meals. So when he knew that there was not much food or no food left for his second family down in the dungeon, and he did not wish to drive the 2-hour round trip to restock, he would simply use his master key to his tenants' apartments, and he would steal food from their cupboards and refrigerators and take it to the cellar. Josef had also wired the cellar's electricity in with the tenant's apartment, so he would not be accountable to pay the electric bill of his secret underground family. The tenants' electricity bills all increased due to this, and they paid it without question, or they would be immediately evicted. Friday, December the 16th, 1994. Josef went into the cellar armed with a pen and paper again. Forcing Elisabeth to write these words, he spoke. "I am so sorry that I have to turn to you again. I hope Lisa is doing well, and I'm sure she has grown some by now. She eats basically anything, but she does prefer her bottle." Josef then grabbed the baby from Elisabeth's arms as she was crying, trying to kiss her baby goodbye. He then took off out the concrete door with Monica, and he placed her inside Lisa's stroller that stayed outside on the front door of his home. He then proceeded to run to a nearby phone booth, and he called his own home. When Rosemarie answered the phone, Josef whispered in a tiny little voice,
"Hello, Mother. It is me, Elisabeth. Don't be mad at me, but I just left my newest daughter at your door, and I cannot tell you where I am. Can you please take care of Monica? I cannot keep her."
Then she hangs up, not giving Rosemarie time to say anything or ask any questions at all. A few hours later, Rosemarie Fritzl shows up at the police station. She has the new baby, the letter, and the story about the very unexpected and shocking phone call from her daughter Elisabeth. Rosemarie was asked if she was certain that it was Elisabeth that she had talked to. Rosemarie said that she was sure it was her daughter. However, what was strange to her was how did Elisabeth get a hold of their new unlisted phone number? as they had changed their number since Elisabeth had been gone, and Rosemarie could not figure out how Elisabeth could have known the new number. In only a few weeks, Rosemarie and Josef had been legally appointed Monica's legal foster parents, and they were awarded an additional $1,500 a month in state benefits. Chapter 12. Pillar of the Community. In 1985, 60-year-old Josef was living large. He was wearing expensive crocodile skin dress shoes. By this time, he was spending almost every night in the dungeon prison with his secret family. It was also in this year that one of Elisabeth's high school friends moved into one of the rooms that Josef had for rent. He lived in this room for 12 years, having no idea that only 30 feet below his rented room was the dungeon prison where his long-time missing classmate, Elisabeth, had been hidden for over a decade, and now with her children. This tenant later said that Josef was a very strange and controlling man, adding, before he would even rent the room to him, that Josef read off to him verbally a very strict set of rules that were mandatory and had zero tolerance of being broken. One of the rules were of the cellar. A tenant was never allowed to go into the basement for any reason whatsoever, making it well known that it was equipped with alarms and cameras, and anyone that dared break this rule of trying to enter the basement be immediately caught and evicted without question or excuse. He also added that he noticed that Josef went into the basement almost every day, saying that he did find it odd that he spent such long hours down there, but did not really find it suspicious at the time, as he was told that is where Mr. Fritzl's business office was located. He also mentioned that the window of his rented room that looked out over the garden, that Josef would load food into a wheelbarrow and push it into the cellar. But this always happened late at night. On April the 29th, 1996, Elisabeth gave birth to twin boys that she named Alex and Michael. Soon after their births, little Michael developed a terrible respiratory infection. Little Michael continued to worsen, and Elisabeth begged Josef to please take him to the hospital, but Josef refused, saying, "What is meant to be will be." 3 days later, little Michael passed away in Elisabeth's arms as Kirsten and Stefan watched. When Josef went down to the cellar and he learned that little Michael had died, he bends down and picked up little Michael's corpse. He walked straight to the incinerator that was used to burn the trash, and without even a second thought, he tossed little Michael's body into the fiery incinerator, while Elisabeth, Kirsten, and Stefan watched. Josef later admitted that he did indeed toss little Michael's dead body into the fire because he needed to get rid of it. After this happened, Elisabeth would never retaliate in any way to her father, no matter what he demanded of her. She became totally submissive to anything he told her to do. She was now bowing down to his every demand for the sake of her children. Josef was very impressed with Elisabeth's newfound compliance in him, so he decided to start rewarding her and the children with a few little gifts. He brought them another TV and even a VCR, and when he would find rugs, tables, furnishings, and dishes that was left on the sides of the road as trash, he would pick it up and smuggle it down to the cellar at night. Elisabeth took these treasures and she placed them around inside the dungeon to make the prison almost look like it was a multi-room apartment, so her kids would know how it felt to actually have a real home. Josef even brought a small fish tank in for Stefan, which he absolutely loved, and he would sit for hours watching the goldfish in the tank. In the summer of 1996, Josef sold his campsite property and guest house on Muncie Lake that he had owned for almost 25 years, and he eventually added more rooms to the dungeon as well, making a small kitchen, a bathroom complete with a stand-up shower and sink, 2 bedrooms for Elisabeth and the kids to sleep in aside from the locked and padded rape room. He also had gotten a credit card in Elisabeth's name, and he ordered racy lingerie with it and had the sexy underwear and lingerie mailed to his home in her name. There were many packages delivered to the home in Elisabeth's name, but somehow this never was noticed by the mail carrier or anyone else. Josef would have Elisabeth dress up in these outfits and demand that the children go into their bedrooms, where he would lock the doors and put porno movies into the VCR and demand Elisabeth perform his favorite parts of these movies on him. After he was satisfied, he would allow the children out of the bedrooms, and while Elisabeth cooked everyone dinner, he would sit on the sofa with the children, watching sports or karate shows with them. Sometimes he would show them photos of their siblings that lived upstairs and tell them about all of the random vacations that their siblings had been on. On August 4th, 1997, Josef forced Elisabeth to write another note. Josef took little Alex, now 15 months old, Michael's surviving twin brother, away from Elisabeth and put him on the front doorstep. Josef went through the same steps as he had with the other children. He claimed that his runaway daughter Elisabeth had left him abandoned on his doorstep to raise, so he legally fostered the child and collected another $1,500 a month from the state. The 3 children Josef had taken from Elisabeth were doing well. Rosemarie took excellent care of her grandchildren, giving them much love and nurturing. Josef insisted the children refer to him and Rosemarie as Mama and Papa. Lisa and Monica were excellent and popular students at their local school. They played ice hockey on the school's team, and they took elaborate and exciting vacations often to Italy with Rosemarie. They were both healthy, although in the beginning Monica did have a heart condition that required her to have surgery. She recovered fully and perfectly. The girls were allowed to have friends from school go over and to go swimming with them in the brand new roof swimming pool that Josef had recently built. Neither girl had any memory of their mother Elisabeth or their siblings that lived only a few floors below them underground. Another couple that rented a room from the Fritzls in 2001 until 2003, and they paid him $675 a month for the tiny room. They confirmed that Josef Jr. did indeed have a key to the cellar, referring to Josef Jr. as the caretaker of the cellar. And he too made frequent visits into the cellar as well, saying they were actually surprised that Josef Jr. still lived at home with his parents, being in his mid-30s, adding that Jr. was also a heavy drinker, and every time they saw him heading down to the cellar, he would have a bottle or beer or liquor in his hand. The couple also reported they sometimes would hear banging noises coming from the cellar and would tell Josef about these noises that they were hearing. Josef brushed it off as just being rusty pipes. There was only one time that Josef ever allowed anyone else to enter the cellar, and that was a plumber that was there to install a toilet system. As the children grew older and taller in the dungeon, they were unable to ever stand up straight due to the low ceilings. This caused Stefan to be permanently crippled, although he did manage to grow to be 5'9". All of the children had permanent issues with their balance, as well as extreme vitamin deficiencies and very weak immune systems. The tunnel connection to the rooms was only 2 foot wide. The dirt walls were always wet and covered in mildew, which caused them all to have constant fungal infections. Elisabeth tried so hard to brighten up the dungeon for her kids so they would have happy things to look at, other than the dirty white towel that was on the bathroom wall. She helped the kids paint big, bold, colorful insects and fish on the bathroom walls, even making decals of the sunshine and stars to cover the musty, dark, damp ceilings. Chapter 13. A Double Life. Josef had discovered and started taking Viagra. This made his sadistic sexual demands even more demonic and cruel. The owner of a brothel that Josef had been a long-time customer of was becoming concerned about Josef's newest demand of the sex workers that were employed there, saying that Josef liked taking the workers to the underground lair of the brothel, referred to as the dungeon. One of the very few prostitutes that would accept Josef as a customer anymore said she charged him $220 an hour for her services. He demanded things like tying her to a large cross, and he would beat her during sex. She later told a reporter that Josef hired her many times, and the man was totally sickening, and he was beyond what the normal mind could ever comprehend. She also recalled asking Josef once about his family, to which he simply replied by saying, "I do not have a family." By December of 1998, Josef felt like he was on top of the world, living his totally secret double life with his 2 wives and 2 families, collecting thousands of dollars every month from the government for the various benefits of the children and his rental properties and rooms. Life was absolutely perfect for Josef. He planned another month-long boys' vacation to Thailand and going to grocery stores at least 50 miles away, and purchased up and stockpiled food in the cellar for Elisabeth and the kids while he was away. A gas station worker, where Josef always gassed up next door to the grocery store where he always purchased the supplies for the cellar, later said that Josef was there every week to gas up. Sometimes he was by himself, but other times his wife, Rosemarie, was with him. Josef was always rude and stingy. He never even gave the gas worker a tip. A tenant said it was always 10 to 11 p.m. at night when he would transfer the food and items into the cellar with the wheelbarrow. Most of the time he done this by himself, but on some occasions Rosemarie would help him, adding that the amount of food he would bring into the cellar was very much, and Rosemarie had to have known, because she would very often help him in transferring the food from the car to the wheelbarrow. A neighbor that lived beside the Fritzls for 11 years later said that he too had observed Josef and Rosemarie loading large amounts of food into the wheelbarrow many times, and always thought that it was very odd that they needed so much food, to the point that they would have to transport it into the home through the cellar with the wheelbarrow. During the Christmas holidays, Josef and Rosemarie would always hold lavish and very festive family meals. The older Fritzl children would always attend these with their significant others and their children. Later, a son-in-law said that they always went to these Christmas holiday gatherings, and that Josef was always outgoing and friendly. He always seemed like a very good family man and father, and he provided very well for his family. However, Rosemarie's sister, Christine, did not like Josef at all. She never forgot about his past that so many others were not even aware of, and she did not hide her dislike for him either. When she attended these Christmas gatherings, she always let it be known. Josef would make snide remarks about Rosemarie during the dinner. He would laugh loudly at his own belittling jokes towards his wife, obviously getting much pleasure from humiliating her in front of everyone else. He would throw slurs to her, things like, "Chubby women are beneath me. My wife is too chubby for me." And Christine would bluntly say, "Better to be chubby than bald." After Christine made that remark, Josef kind of gave a funny snicker, and within a few weeks he went straight to Vienna for a very expensive hair transplant. After everyone had left the dinner, Josef would go into the dungeon to celebrate Christmas with his second secret family. He would bring them small gifts and even sweets. One year, Josef even brought them a small Christmas tree that Elisabeth and the kids got to decorate together. Chapter 14, His Underground Kingdom. In the later part of 1990, fire inspectors showed up at the Fritzls' front door to conduct a routine fire inspection. Josef was very polite and compliant, leading the inspectors into the cellar's heating room, which was only yards away from the secret dungeon. The inspectors closely looked at the heating boiler system that Josef had thrown little Michael's body into 3 years earlier. The inspectors were impressed, and they declared that it met all of the requirements. However, even though Josef was 65 years old, his ambitions were still very high. He had a plan to build a large apartment complex, complete with a garage. He obtained $1.5 million in loans using other various properties as collateral. When the apartment building plan did not pan out due to some fraudulent tax issues, he pretended that he would be using the money to start a woman's underwear business on the internet. Josef did obtain this large loan. However, his plan to build the apartment complex never happened, as residents around the area that he intended to build the complex on complained that it would bring many problems to their neighborhood. A business friend of Josef's said that he and Josef would visit a local swingers club that had an underground sex dungeon that could be rented out by the night. He added that one night he was at the club by himself when he saw Josef and his wife Rosemary enter the club. Josef ordered Rosemary to sit in the corner while he walked into a room with a much younger, hired female. Josef proceeded to have sex with this girl while Rosemary watched. After Josef was finished with the young girl, he motioned for Rosemary to come out of the corner, and they proceeded to go home together. In 2020, Josef and Rosemary celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. They had a small party with friends and family. Rosemary carried on the perfect family charade in front of everyone, continuing to brag about how proud she was of the 3 young grandchildren that they were raising. Social workers came by to visit with the children sporadically. All of their notes always just raved about what amazing grandparents Rosemary and Josef were to these children that were now ages 8, 6, and 4, and about how smart and polite these children were. Rosemary was now in her middle 60s, and she always drove the children to their sports practices as well as to their music lessons. Lisa played the flute, and Monica and Alex played the trumpet. Rosemary always let the children know that their mother had abandoned them to join a cult. Rosemary had the children absolutely terrified of Elisabeth. Alex was so traumatized and afraid that his mother may someday come and kidnap him from his bed that he almost became nonverbal. When Lisa first started to school, her teacher was shocked at Lisa referring to the elderly Fritzls as Mama and Papa, that she called them to come to the school and speak with her. The teacher explained to Rosemary and Josef that they must tell the children the truth about who their parents truly were, or when they found out eventually someday, this secondhand news was going to be very shocking. So Rosemary hired a child psychologist so they could have counseling, and from that point on, the children referred to them as Grandma and Grandpa. When Lisa was 11 years old, she convinced Josef to enroll her into a prestigious Catholic girls' school. The 2 younger children continued going to the local public school where Rosemary was a member of the PTA. When Lisa started the Catholic school, she started telling the other classmates that her mother had left her on her grandparents' doorstep when she was just a little baby. But years later, when Alex started high school, he told classmates a very different story. He told them that his mother was dead. In February of 2002, after being in the dungeon for 18 years, Elisabeth became pregnant for the 7th time. By this time, she was suffering terribly from extreme vitamin deficiencies, stress, and malnourishment and gum diseases. The gum disease had caused almost all of her teeth to fall out. Elisabeth was now in her mid-30s, and her once beautiful red hair was now solid gray. Through all of Elisabeth's pain, she never complained in front of Kirsten and Stefan. She never wanted them to worry about her, and wanted their lives to be just as normal as she could possibly make it. Later, Josef even bragged about how strong Elisabeth was during her life, saying, "She never really made things complicated for herself or me. She never even complained when her teeth were falling out one by one." The final time that Elisabeth became pregnant, Josef no longer raped her, as now he was not attracted to her at all. It was at this point that investigators were convinced that Josef then turned his sexual attention onto the pale and weak 13-year-old Kirsten to take her mother's place. December the 16th, 2002, Elisabeth delivered baby boy Felix. Josef told Elisabeth that this new baby would stay in the dungeon with her and Kirsten and Stefan, and that Rosemarie just could not physically handle raising another child right now. He then brought in a small washing machine into the cellar so that Elisabeth would not have to wash all of their clothing by hand anymore. A few months into 2003, Josef made Elisabeth write yet another letter, writing that she had given birth to another baby boy in December, and that was it. Josef again drove 100 miles away, and he mailed this letter to himself. Chapter 15, Losing Control. In the summer of 2003, Josef's perfect world started coming to a head. The loans that he had taken out to build the apartment complex were coming due. He was on the verge of bankruptcy and unable to pay his bills and maintain the perfect life and the persona that he had painted for the outside world. He was also finding almost impossible to continue supporting both of his families. Then, late one night in August, a suspicious fire broke out in one of his first-floor rental rooms. When the firefighters arrived, Josef and Josef Jr. was trying to fight the fire out themselves. A few days later, Josef claimed a check for $15,000 from the insurance company. That is why investigators felt that this fire may have been intentionally set by Josef, as he had a history of collecting large sums of insurance money from suspicious fires. 2 police officers were sent to the Fritzl home to investigate it for a suspected arson. An investigative source later said that the fire had been set in 2 separate places, which is a classic sign of arson. The investigation was brushed over quickly, and no one ever noticed the secret dungeon 2 floors below the fire. Ironically, Christmas of 2003, another fire broke out in the Fritzl home in a 3rd-floor room. Josef claimed that a television just burst into flames in his children's bedroom. He went on to claim a $4,500 insurance check from this fire. A few months into 2004, he claimed an additional $1,500 insurance check when he claimed that one of his power meters had caught on fire. After Josef added up his claimed personal losses from these 2 most current fires, the insurance company settled up with him, paying him an additional $20,000 in losses, and they never ran any sort of investigation into these claims. In April of 2005, Josef turned 70 years old. Rosemarie threw him a birthday party. 10 of his surviving 13 children attended the party, as well as a few close friends. August 28, 2005. This marked the 25th anniversary of Elisabeth's captivity in the dungeon. Elisabeth and her 3 remaining children were getting weaker every day. She was always begging her father for better conditions for her and her 3 children. Escaping was not ever something that Elisabeth even contemplated doing. She always fully believed her father's warnings about the traps being on the doors, and the dungeon would immediately turn into a deathly gas chamber if she ever tried to escape. 3 children had no idea that their lives were not absolutely normal. They thought everyone lived the exact same way they did. They never knew they were actually prisoners, and there was a whole other world just feet above them. Stefan was now 15 years old, and he had grown into a nice-looking young man. However, The low, mildewed ceilings in the dungeon had stunted his growth to where he only grew to be 5 foot 9 inches tall, and even growing that tall, he had to bend down to walk through the dungeon. So he normally just crawled around on his hands and knees to go from room to room, as it was just easier than constantly having to be hunched over. Elisabeth and all of the children had severely impacted posture. As Felix grew into a toddler, he and Stefan became very close, and they formed a very tight bond, forming their own language with each other, which was mostly just like animal growls and coos. In 2006, Rosemarie and Josef celebrated their golden wedding anniversary, 50 years. The entire town celebrated with the Fritzls for this amazing occasion. Even the mayor was there to celebrate and speak very kind words about this magnificent couple. They were praised by everyone for being such amazing grandparents who had raised their grandchildren that were abandoned by their selfish and uncaring mother who had ran away to join a cult. All 3 of the grandchildren excelled in school. Alex, who was now 10 years old, was an award-winning ice hockey player. Later, classmates would even say that Alex was always so nice to everyone and always the first to help anyone with anything. In June of 2007, 16-year-old Lisa graduated from the girls' Catholic school. Josef bought her a beautiful dress to wear to the graduation celebration. Later, a former classmate would say of Lisa of how very popular she was with everyone and how she was like a class clown. She was always making everyone laugh. She was a very normal and beautiful girl. Josef was now 72 years old, and he was becoming more and more paranoid. He did not have the energy that he used to take care of his 2 families, and living this double life nowadays, trying to keep up with it, was completely tiring him out. That winter, it was very cold and dark. Elisabeth and the children were becoming more and more weak by the day in this damp, cool dungeon. Kirsten's teeth were now also starting to fall out. They were all having problems with circulation and heart problems as well. They were also severely anemic, and having the flu, Felix and Kirsten were running very high fevers. Josef was growing tired of having to deal with this secret underground family. He was no longer needing or wanting sex from Elisabeth due to not being attracted to her at all. She was toothless and had totally gray hair. Kirsten was no good to use as a sex slave either, as she was too frail and weak to perform the demands that Josef required of his sex slaves. Also, all of the having to go out of town to shop and sneak food into the cellar was starting to just become a nuisance to Josef. So he was trying to figure out a way to bring Elisabeth and the children upstairs and come up with some sort of explanation to everyone about their sudden return. He had contemplated killing them all, but decided it would be way too difficult to dispose of their corpse completely, as throwing their bodies into the incinerator would not be as easily hidden as it was throwing a 3-day-old baby's corpse into the fiery pit. By Christmas of 2007, Josef had come up with a plan to bring Elisabeth and the children upstairs, as it was becoming just way too much for him to continue taking care of both of them separately. So once again, Josef went to the cellar and gave Elisabeth a pen and paper, telling her what to write. Elisabeth wrote in this letter that she was getting tired of living in the cult, and she just wanted to come home. She talked about Kirsten's health failing, going on to say that she hoped that soon they would all be reunited and celebrate the holidays and birthdays together. She went on to add that she hoped she would be back home within the next 6 months. Josef took the letter to another town and emailed it to his home, hoping that his timeline of mailing it would be accurate for the letter to be delivered to his home during their Christmas celebration. and it would be a shocking special gift to Rosemarie. Chapter 16. Into the Light. At the Christmas family gathering in 2007, Josef made a special announcement to the family that he had received yet another letter from Elisabeth, and she was making plans to leave the cult and come back home, and she would be bringing with her her 3 children. During the next few months, Josef talked a lot about Elisabeth's return with Rosemarie and the kids. In early April of 2008, 19-year-old Kirsten had become deathly sick, and due to the lack of fresh oxygen, she had started having many seizures. Elisabeth gave her the only medication that she had ever had in the dungeon, and that's aspirin. And this obviously was doing nothing at all to fight off the infections that was riddling Kirsten's frail body. The infections escalated very quickly to a point that set her into a complete mental and physical breakdown. She began pulling out her own hair in big clumps. Elisabeth was trying her best to comfort her daughter and nurture her in between her having these seizures. This was really all she could do to help her. On Elisabeth's 42nd birthday, April the 16th, 2008, Josef made his appearance into the dungeon, bringing Elisabeth a small birthday gift. But Elisabeth was not one bit interested in the gift, or the fact that it was her birthday. She was, though, worried sick about her daughter Kirsten. She begged her father to let Kirsten go to the hospital. Josef seen how deathly sick Kirsten was, and he knew that there was no way that Kirsten was going to be able to survive much longer in the condition she was inside the damp and moldy cellar. However, Josef decided that he would not let Kirsten out of the cellar until Rosemarie left to go on her upcoming vacation the following Friday, on April the 18th. After Rosemarie left, Kirsten's health had deteriorated terribly. She was experiencing horrific cramps. Her body was even convulsing. She was biting her lips until they were bloody, chewing her tongue, and she had lost consciousness. Elisabeth begged and pleaded with Josef to please take Kirsten to the hospital so maybe they can save her life. Eventually, he said, "Okay, I will take her, but you have to write a note. I will tell you what to write, and I will give the note to the doctors. Please help my daughter. She has never been to a hospital before." After Elisabeth wrote the entire note that Josef dictated, and in the very early morning hours of April the 19th, Elisabeth Fritzl saw the light of day and took her first breath of fresh air in 24 years, while she was helping her father to put her unconscious 19-year-old daughter on the front doorstep. Leaving Kirsten on the doorstep, Josef quickly brought Elisabeth back into the dungeon and shut the large, heavy concrete door behind him. Josef then went back upstairs and he called 911. He explained to the dispatcher that he had found an unconscious woman lying on his front doorstep. Josef watched out the window for the ambulance to arrive and load Kirsten up into it and drive away. After a few hours had passed, Josef drove to the hospital emergency room. Going inside the emergency department, Josef demanded to see the doctor that was treating Kirsten, saying that he had very important information concerning his granddaughter that was just brought in. Josef was sent to the ICU unit. He handed the doctor the note that Elisabeth had written and told the doctor that he had found the letter in Kirsten's coat pocket before he called for help. He went on to inform the doctor that his daughter had ran away decades ago to join a cult, and this is the 4th child that she had abandoned on his doorstep within the last 2 decades. Josef asked the doctor to treat Kirsten and take care of these infections and illnesses, and added that he did not want the police to be contacted, and then he walked out of the hospital. After Josef arrived back home later that evening, the police came to his house to question him about his granddaughter. Josef, being his normal, calm, and cool self, told the police about his daughter Elisabeth running away from home to join the cult 24 years ago, and he had not seen her since. He handed over the letter that he had Elisabeth write in December, saying that she was making plans to return home with her 3 children and leave the cult. The following Monday, April the 21st, Josef received a call from the doctor letting him know that Kirsten's health was deteriorating rapidly and she was very close to death. She was suffering multiple organ failures, and she had been placed into a medically induced coma, adding that it was quite literally a matter of life and death for Kirsten that they be able to contact her mother. Josef replied only by saying that he had no idea where Elisabeth was or even what cult that she was a part of, and he hung up the phone. Later that night, Kirsten's doctor was broadcasted on the local news asking for anyone's help in locating her mother, as this was literally a matter of life and death and being able to treat her. After watching the news broadcast, Josef called Rosemarie, wanting to be able to let her know what was happening at home before she heard it from someone else that may have watched it on the news broadcast. Josef told Rosemarie that she needed to cut her vacation short and come on home because Elisabeth had abandoned another child on their doorstep, and this one was deathly ill and looked like she was even an adult. The next day, reporters were knocking on his door asking for interviews. Josef was livid. He said he was very upset that the doctor had went to the news about their personal business and made trouble for his family. He then demanded that the reporters leave his property, and he gave them strict orders, do not return. On Wednesday, April the 23rd, police arrived once again at Josef's front door. This time they were asking for a DNA sample to compare to Kirsten's to make certain that she was indeed Elisabeth's daughter. Josef refused to give a DNA sample, saying he did not have time to deal with all that. By Friday, Rosemarie and two of Elisabeth's children, Lisa and Monica, complied with police and they gave DNA samples. Josef, however, continued to put it off. Meanwhile, Elisabeth and her two remaining children in the dungeon were worried sick, and they were so concerned about Kirsten's condition. When Josef finally did go into the dungeon and Elisabeth asked him how she was doing, all he would say is, "She is recovering." Josef called the district governor and thanked him and the hospital and the doctor for the excellent treatment that his granddaughter was receiving at the hospital. The call was very impressive to the district governor, saying that Josef was an outstanding man that had great morals and mannerism. That night, Elisabeth and Stefan were watching the news on the television in the dungeon when a photo was shown on the news of Elisabeth. The doctor made a statement saying that he had to have Elisabeth to come forward. They needed very important medical information on Kirsten in order for them to be able to accurately treat her and save her life, as she was in dire straits and very near death. When Josef returned to the cellar, Elisabeth begged him to allow her to go to the hospital and talk to the doctor so he could save Kirsten's life. She swore to Josef that as soon as she talked to the doctor, that she would go right back into the cellar without question or retaliation. She just wanted Kirsten to live. The next morning, Josef decided that he would free Elisabeth and the other two children so that she could go and speak with the doctor. But he made Elisabeth swear that she would never tell the truth, that she had been locked inside the dungeon for 24 years. She would have to continue with the story that she had been away with a cult for the last 24 years, adding that if she betrayed him, that she would regret it. Elisabeth fully agreed. After Rosemarie left that Saturday morning with the three children to run some errands, Josef went into the dungeon and got Elisabeth, Stefan, and Felix, bringing them up the stairs and out of the dungeon into the daylight. It had been 8,516 days since Elisabeth was forced into this underground prison. When Rosemarie and the children arrived back home, they were absolutely shocked to find these three strangers sitting in the living room. Josef made the announcement to them that Elisabeth and her two other children had finally decided to come home. Rosemarie was completely shocked to see Chapter 17. Freedom. Elisabeth arrived at the hospital and was sent straight to the doctor's office. Josef waited for her outside in his Mercedes. The doctor had many questions he wanted to ask Elisabeth. However, he refrained from asking everything that he really wanted to know about where Elisabeth had been for the last 24 years. He kept his questions focused on Kirsten's illness and how and when this had all started. Elisabeth answered his questions as best she could without any mention of their life inside the dungeon underground. She told the doctor about when the symptoms had begun and what they were and what little she was doing to try and treat them before she was found unconscious on her parents' doorstep. After answering the questions as well as she could, she told the doctor that she had to go now, and she left. The minute Elisabeth walked out of the doctor's office, he immediately contacted the police. Police apprehended Josef and Elisabeth before they were even able to pull out of the hospital gates. They were both taken into the police station and questioned in separate rooms. At the beginning of the interrogations, the police were far more concerned with Elisabeth than they were Josef, as they fully believed that Elisabeth was a terrible mother that had abandoned her children for many years and dropping them off on her parents' doorstep. During questioning, Elisabeth would not even speak. She only stared straight ahead at the wall. This went on for several hours. Finally, police were able to gain her trust. They promised her that her nor her children would ever have to see her father again. She was finally able to believe them, and she broke down to them and told her story. She told the truth, that she had never abandoned her children, and that she had been held a prisoner by her father for the last 24 years. For 2 hours, Elisabeth opened up her heart and told her horrific true story to the investigators, who just sat in shock and listened to her every word. She told how she had been abused by her father since she was only 11 years old. Yet, she had never really ever told anyone because she was too ashamed. She explained to them how her father had lured her into the dungeon, the things that he had done to her, and how he shackled her in the beginning and would not even return for many days. She told how she tried to fight back in the beginning and how she would bang on the walls and scream until she lost her voice, adding that she eventually just gave up trying to fight him off or to scream for help because she learned that none of it was doing her any good and it was only making her life more miserable. She went on to tell them that it was 9 months before her father would take the chains and the shackles off of her so she could walk around the tiny dungeon, but she was warned to never try and escape or to even touch the door to try to get out, or these deadly gases was going to be released and turn the dungeon into a gas chamber. She told them how she got pregnant the first time after she had been in prison for 4 years, and how she miscarried this child. Soon afterwards, she had become pregnant again, and during the latter part of her pregnancy, Josef did stop raping Elisabeth until after Kirsten was born in 1988, but soon after that, her father began again. Within a few months, she was pregnant again, and she had given birth to Stefan, a year after Kirsten was born. She told how within the next few years, after Kirsten and Stefan's birth, she would become pregnant 3 more times with Lisa, Monica, Alex, and Michael, and how her father made her write these notes, and he took the 3 children from her and he would bring them upstairs. Elisabeth became very emotional when talking about the birth of her twins, Alex and Michael, talking about how both of the babies were born with serious respiratory problems, and how she was hoping that their breathing would regulate correctly. But little Michael was too weak and way too sickly, and she had begged her father to take him to the hospital before he passed away at only 3 days old in her arms. Josef took Michael and threw his tiny body into the burning incinerator, and then when Alex was 9 months old, Josef came and took him away as well and brought him upstairs. She went on to tell them how Josef had made her and the children dig the tunnel and the area for the 2 more rooms in the dungeon, and how after she gave birth to her last child, Felix, in 2002, Josef had finally stopped raping her, saying that he was not attracted to her anymore, as she was now completely gray-headed and she only had a few teeth left. She told investigators that her father was the only culprit behind her being in the dungeon, and her mother had no knowledge of it whatsoever. Within the next 2 hours, Elisabeth spoke with detectives, pouring her heart out and telling her horrific story. She was able to sum up her entire 24 years of hell living in the secret underground prison. At that point, the detectives went to Josef, who was waiting in a different interview room down the hall. To begin with, Josef refused to say anything other than he just wanted to be left in peace. But eventually he broke, and he admitted to building this underground prison and locking his daughter away in it for 24 years. He nonchalantly admitted to the incest as well as all threats that the deadly gas chamber would be released into the prison if they ever tried to escape. His excuse for locking his daughter away and imprisoning her for 24 years was for her own good. He actually said that he was doing her a favor and he was saving her from hanging out with the wrong crowd and drinking and doing drugs with them. When they began drilling him about having sex with his own daughter, Josef answered very calmly and with no sort of regret or embarrassment whatsoever. And he said, "Yes, I had sex with her, but I haven't for many months now." When asked why he decided to take the 3 children upstairs for Rosemarie to raise, he again answered very calmly, saying, "They were sickly and cried all the time, and I was afraid that their crying may cause unwanted attention if the tenants heard it." Josef finally asked if he regretted what he had done to Elisabeth, and very matter-of-factly he said, "Why should I have regrets? I saved Elisabeth from drugs and alcohol." Josef finally signed to give a DNA test, and he was arrested for incest and holding his daughter in captivity for 24 years. Investigators said that Josef showed absolutely no remorse for anything that he had done, adding that he was just so narcissistic that they do not even believe that he thinks he's done anything wrong at all. While Josef was being arrested, police went to the Fritzl home and collected Stefan and Felix to take them to the hospital so they could both be examined. The boys were very quiet, and aside from each other and their mother, and the few people that they had seen within the last 24 hours, these officers were the first people that they had ever seen in their entire lives other than on TV. The officers said that they were very gentle in dealing with the boys, as they were very frail and pale. But they were also very surprised at how very well-mannered and educated the boys were, seeing as how they had never seen people or been out from underground their entire lives. The natural light was very bright to their eyes, and they had a hard time adjusting to it, as it was the first time they had ever seen sunlight. However, the boys were in complete awe and mesmerized seeing daylight for the first time ever. When Felix, 5 years old, looked up at the sky that night and he saw the moon, he couldn't hardly understand it. His eyes got huge and he pointed and said, "Is that God? Is this heaven?" The boys were in the back of the police cruiser headed to the hospital, and they continued to look at the sky and point at things and nudge each other. They were totally fascinated at the things that they were seeing for the first time ever in their life. Even though they had saw cars on television, actually riding in a car was so surreal to them. They were so excited, but scared as well. When they noticed the cars coming towards them in the other direction, though, they both got terrified, thinking that the car was going to hit them head-on. Little Felix started humming to himself with his eyes closed, this as a security blanket measure that his mother had taught him to do whenever he was afraid. The officer that drove the children to the station said he had seen a whole lot in his years on the force, but he had never seen anything like this, and the way this family had suffered. Upon their arrival at the hospital, Stefan and Felix were met by their mother, who had also just arrived back at the hospital from the police station. They were all examined physically and evaluated mentally to determine the course of the treatments that they each needed. Kirsten, however, was still in a medically induced coma at the hospital's ICU floor. Elisabeth was terribly malnourished. Her skin was milky white. Her hair had prematurely grayed. Her skin had wrinkled to a point of a woman that was 20 years older than what she actually was. She had lost, by this time, all of her teeth, and her gums were black and riddled with diseases. All of her bones were very brittle. She walked with a limp, and her back and shoulders were hunched over from not being able to walk upright and straight for 24 years. Both Stefan and Felix also had several many health issues, just like Elisabeth. They also had acute vitamin deficiencies and, of course, anemia. 18-year-old Stefan also had terrible motor skills, and his back and shoulders were hunched as well. He also had bone issues, making it very difficult for him to walk upright. Stefan and Kirsten had both lost most of their teeth. 5-year-old Felix was actually the healthiest of them all. Even though he crawled in the stance of a monkey on his hands and feet, he could stand upright and walk on his legs when he wanted to. All of their eyes were affected negatively. They were given dark goggles to wear outside until their eyes could get accustomed to being in natural sunlight. They were prescribed the strongest sunscreens to use any time they walked outside, and this was to protect their very delicate and pale skin from the sun rays. When Rosemary learned what Josef had done, she had a complete mental breakdown, went into shock, and had to be hospitalized. The investigators noticed how Stefan and Felix had their own language they used to talk to each other, saying that most of it really just consisted of mumbles and grunting and sort of animal noises.
Chapter 18, A Reunion. Rosemary brought Elisabeth's 3 children, Lisa, Monica, and Alex, to the psychiatric hospital so the children could meet their siblings. This was a very important meeting, and it was unknown how Elisabeth's 2 sets of children were going to take to each other. Rosemary was equally as worried about having to face her daughter now that she knew what she had endured for the last 24 years, while her and Elisabeth's remaining children were only a few floors above, and to tell Stefan and Alex that they had been held prisoners inside the dungeon along with their mother by their father, who also happened to be their grandfather. This meeting was totally out of the ordinary for everyone, and everyone involved with this meeting were very concerned about how it was going to go. When Rosemary and Elisabeth met again, they immediately embraced each other. Elisabeth told her mother, "I can't believe I'm finally free. I did not think I would ever see you again." Rosemary, hugging her daughter, said that she loved her so much, and she promised her that they would never be separated again. She continued to tell Elisabeth she was so sorry, and she had no idea what Josef had done. Then Lisa, Monica, and Alex were brought into the room. Elisabeth ran to her kids, crying and stroking their faces and saying, "My babies, you're all so beautiful." More of Elisabeth's own siblings entered the room, including her oldest sister and her brother Harold, whom she had once been so very close to. They would all be starting this new journey together, beginning today with their first family therapy session. Elisabeth's older sister said they were all in a state of shock after learning what had happened at the hands of their own father. But now they were all back together and would get to know each other again and rebuild their family together. After the session, the doctor said, after seeing them all together for this and how they all reacted with each other, he was more than convinced that Rosemary indeed never knew nothing of Elisabeth being held as a prisoner. The director later said that the meeting went better than anyone could have ever assumed, adding that the children that had lived their lives in the cellar did act as they had expected that they would, given their circumstances. They can speak somewhat, but they are far from being in a normal state of mind. Later that night, police brought Josef back to the Fritzl home so he could escort them into the dungeon and showed them where he had hidden his daughter and their grandchildren away for almost a quarter of a century. Josef led them through 5 different doors, through the cellar and into his own personal workshop. He then pointed to the shelf, which held random paint cans and various other miscellaneous items. Behind that shelf was a hidden concrete door that weighed 660 pounds. They had Josef give them the code for the huge, heavy concrete door, as well as the codes to the next 6 doors that they were going to have to go through that led them inside the prison dungeon. Then Josef was brought back out with officers to return to the jail. The investigators walked through the tunnel, unlocking the 6 doors one by one until they finally entered into the dungeon through a 4-foot door where they found a strange maze of very small rooms, all connected to each other with a ceiling height of no more than 5 foot. They noticed almost immediately that the dungeon had very poor air quality with very little air. There was a complete kitchen, 2 bedrooms, one with the bathroom with a stand-up shower. There were colorful children's painted posters on the walls and the ceilings. They also found a cell that was covered top to bottom, floor to ceiling, that was padded with rubber. There was also another bathroom that was decorated with colorful drawings, starfish and goldfish, and the moldy ceiling had cut out art of stars taped to it. One of the detectives that walked through the dungeon compared it to watching a horror movie, saying, "There are some things that you just do not want to see." Within a few hours, teams of forensic detectives were also inside the dungeon, taking photos and gathering evidence. Across town, Josef Fritzl was being booked into the jail and was placed under suicide watch. Later that night, the police made a press release to the public stating that they had found a 42-year-old woman who they were referring to as Elisabeth F. Elisabeth had been missing since August of 1984, going on to say that during this time, 3 children were left on her parents' doorsteps in the years of 1993, 1994, and 1997, accompanied by a note from Elisabeth asking her parents to care for her children, adding that it was recently revealed that Elisabeth had been imprisoned by her father since her disappearance inside the cellar of their own home for the last 24 years, and that Josef had been molesting her since she was only 11 years old. While Elisabeth was being imprisoned in the cellar, she had to give birth to 7 of her father's children. Each one she delivered herself with nothing for her pain except an aspirin. One of her children, which was a twin, passed away soon after he was born. The 3 children Josef took from Elisabeth and brought upstairs for him and Rosemarie to raise were legally adopted to or fostered by Josef and Rosemarie, and they were currently awaiting the results of the DNA to confirm that Elisabeth's 6 surviving children were indeed fathered by Josef Fritzl. He went on to add that this was the most prolific case they had ever had in Amstetten, assuring the public that Rosemarie had no idea about her daughter's imprisonment, and she truly believed that Elisabeth had ran away and joined a cult. After the press release, the citizens of their community was absolutely shocked to learn of this, as the Fritzl home was located on a very busy street, and everyone in the town had walked by the home at some point during Elisabeth's imprisonment. And during the years that she and the children were being held captive in the cellar, there were more than 100 different renters that had lived in the Fritzl home, in the rented room, just mere feet above the dungeon. Many of the former tenants later said, when they learned of this, they all thought to themselves that the many times that they had heard the banging and the noises that Josef claimed were the pipes, this was actually Elisabeth and the children begging for help to be rescued. In the following days, curious onlookers stopped in front of the home, watching in disbelief as the teams and investigators brought out bags and bags of evidence from the cellar. One neighbor told a reporter that she had always kept her distance from Josef, as he always seemed so controlling and rude. But she had talked to Rosemarie several times, and she had told her about how much she worried about and missed her daughter Elisabeth that had ran away to join a cult. Another neighbor said of Josef that he seemed to be very successful and took excellent care of his children, and that he didn't really even associate with many people, but when he did, he was always very friendly. They really seemed like a great family, and that just goes to show you that you can't always know what is going on behind closed doors. Josef's best friend, who he had taken vacations with many times, said he felt just sick, knowing the many times that he and his wife had went to their home for dinner or gatherings, and now knowing what was happening, just feet below them, is unbelievable. And he was ashamed to have even known Josef or be linked to him in any sort of way. The only person in the Fritzl family that would agree to give an interview was Elisabeth's oldest sister's ex-husband. He said that when he was married to Gabrielle, they had lived in the Fritzl home for 3 years, and he had even went into the cellar on several occasions, adding that he never had any idea whatsoever that only a few meters away from the cellar entrance, a whole other family was being prisoned and living in there. Reporters from all over the world were around the Fritzl home recording the footages and speaking to any neighbor or friend that would talk to them. All of the grown Fritzl children went into hiding. When they would go into the clinic for their family therapy sessions, they absolutely refused to speak to any of the many reporters that were always there, just waiting for their arrival. Reporters finally tracked down Elisabeth's closest brother, Harold, to his small home that was located only 15 miles from the Fritzl family home. However, Harold's wife met them on her front porch, screaming to them, "Leave us alone." On Monday, police released publicly in a press conference photos of the prison dungeon that investigators had taken. However, they refused to release the photos of the bedrooms or the rubber cell that Josef had constructed to use when he raped Elisabeth. The chief held up a mugshot of Josef Fritzl, saying that he was leading a double life with his wife, Rosemarie, and their 7 children, and a second family with 7 children with his own daughter, adding that other properties that Josef owned were being investigated now to make sure that there were no other dungeons under them. They did not believe that they would find any others, as this one most likely occupied the biggest part of his time and energy. The doctor from the therapy session spoke, saying that Elisabeth and all 6 children were doing incredibly well. When it was time to take some questions, the reporter's questions seemed to center around Rosemarie and whether or not she knew or played any part in helping Josef with this secret prison. The answers were brief, basically saying the criminal is always one step ahead of the police and authorities, and if anyone would have sensed anything, they would have acted. The Fritzl home became a twisted tourist attraction. One of Monica's teachers even organized a field trip for their class to go there and view the home so Monica's other classmates could have an idea and a feel of what Monica's family lived and went through. The teacher said the children are desperate to see it for themselves, and there is no need in keeping it from them, as that will only make it worse, and they will eventually find out about it anyway, because this is all anyone is talking about. 19. It's beyond comprehension. As medical staff were working to save Kirsten's life, Josef Fritzl, her father, went before the judge. He remained emotionless and calm as the judge handed down an extended 14-day jail stay while the pretrial investigation was being continued. Josef hid his face from news crews as he was led back to the awaiting police car to return to jail, as the public waited patiently for news of Josef's pretrial. During the public press conference, it was said, "This case is beyond comprehension. A case of extreme brutality and horror. This is the most shattering case that has ever came to light in Austria." Earlier that morning, it had been printed in the local newspaper that Josef Fritzl had a previous rape charge, and in the early 70s, it was well known to everyone that Josef was a convicted rapist. Later that evening, there was yet another press conference called for by the chief. It was announced that DNA tests had confirmed that all of Elisabeth's 7 children were fathered by Josef Fritzl, her own biological father. Furthermore, it has also been confirmed that no other male had ever went into the cellar the entire time Elisabeth was held in prison there. This ruled out any other accomplices or possibilities that Elisabeth had ever been with any other man during these years. Charges were also being considered to charge Josef with the murder by failure to act of baby Michael and throwing his body into the incinerator, which Josef had admitted to doing. Josef Fritzl deceived everyone around him, including his own wife and children. We have never seen anything like this. Adding that originally the cellar was very small, and as Elisabeth birthed children throughout these 24 years, the cellar was made larger to accommodate more people. Josef Fritzl had a large sex drive, but we do not know why or how he would go to this level of incomprehensible acts to satisfy his libido, as he has not given any sort of motive yet. Closing the conference, saying that the investigation was still very active and ongoing, and many things they needed to investigate and find out about Elisabeth's life and how she managed to give birth 8 times, including the miscarriage, all alone with no medical care or medications at all, and even raising some of her children down there, even to adulthood. Police denied being aware of Josef's prior rape conviction. Rosemarie's sister spoke with a reporter, saying that the only reason Rosemarie stayed with Josef after that was because she wanted to keep her family together. And at the time, she and Josef had 4 children. She went on to say that it was very wrong of the legal system of Austria to remove and delete criminal records after 15 years. This had been known and publicly available. It is very possible that Josef would have been looked into after Elisabeth had been missing for an extended amount of time. She added that sexual offenses should never be deleted from criminal records. She defended her sister by saying that Rosemarie had no idea that Elisabeth was locked in the cellar for 24 years. Even though Josef did spend many, many nights down there, Rosemarie believed that he was working those long hours making blueprints, and no one was ever to disturb him nor dare go down there while he was working. Rosemarie is completely shattered to have learned this, as her children are her whole world. She cannot believe that Josef was capable of doing this to their own daughter. During all of this time, the staff at the therapy clinic threw a birthday party for Alex Fritzl. As this was his 12th birthday, Alex received gifts and he was surrounded by his brothers and sisters. But a few miles away, his older sister, Kirsten, was still fighting for her life in the hospital. She was now on life support ventilators and dialysis. The doctor at the clinic spoke to reporters, saying that the children were all residing together in a room at the clinic. They do keep the lights dimmed very low, as well as blackout curtains on the windows to help Elisabeth and the children's very poor eyesight slowly start adapting to sunlight. The clinic also made somewhat of a replica in a cargo area. This replica represented the dungeon in the event that the outside world and normal world became way too overwhelming for them. There was even a goldfish tank put in for Stefan, much like the one that he enjoyed looking at for hours and hours inside the dungeon. Chapter 20, Hey Satan, Come Out and Play. On Wednesday, April the 30th of 2008, Council made a major announcement in the heat of the Josef Fritzl scandal, saying that Austria was not the land of dungeon people. We will not allow our whole country to be held hostage by one man. This is an unfathomable criminal case, but it is also an isolated case. The public really did not take to this announcement favorably. In an article in the newspaper, the editorial section said, "This seems unfair to Elisabeth and her children, that this case seems to be being held to a political standard." Another victim of a very similar case, victim Natasha, spoke out about women's rights and socialism, and she donated $37,000 of her own money to Elisabeth and her children's fund, and she encouraged others to follow her lead. Natasha explained how Elisabeth's case was so similar to hers and said that she hoped that the family would pull through this, adding that it may be likely that only the youngest child would ever be able to pick up and carry on a normal life. A fund was set up for the care and housing of Elisabeth and her family, which was expected to take up to 8 years, and Josef Fritzl was $3 million in debt. So his estate and net worth was not even an option to help cover the estimated $1.5 million that it was going to take to care for the family both medically and housing. Newspapers, news channels, and celebrities donated to the fundraiser to help the family. Josef Fritzl was aware of everything that was going on in the news, and he was reading the newspapers and about the fundraisers to help his victim family. Yet, he stayed calm and cool and never showed any emotions or seemed the least bit affected by any of it. His 36-year-old prison roommate stated that Josef wanted to see every newscast about him, as well as read any article that was printed about him, saying that he acted like it was a game to him. Josef's cell was complete with a television, radio, and stereo system. He had access to all of the newspapers and magazines that he desired. His bed was comfortable, with clean linens daily. There was also a table complete with 2 chairs, and even a potted plant that sat next to his large window. He had 3 balanced meals every day brought to him. These meals were prepared by a nutritionist and was complete with fresh fruits and vegetables. His cell was a mansion compared to the dungeon that he had locked Elisabeth and the children away in for decades. There was a problem, though. All of the other inmates knew of his crimes, and any sort of sexual crimes were not looked at very well at all by other inmates, especially Josef's crimes. Every night they would beat on his walls, screaming at him, "Hey Satan, we're going to get you." A warden stated that Josef was terrified for his life, and the only reason he even had a cellmate was so that he could report back to them anything that Josef may say, as well as to make sure he does not try to commit suicide. There was even a bounty out for his head by the other inmates that would be paid out to the first inmate that attacked and killed him. Josef was a fan of watching true crime documentaries, so he was well aware that he would have to obtain the best attorney he could find. So he selected one of the highest profile attorneys in Austria. He had previously seen him on television, and of course, with this being such a high profile case, the attorney immediately agreed to take his case. Mia said he was not shocked by what Josef had done, adding that Josef was being portrayed by the public as a monster and a sexual tyrant, saying that Josef was not like the other criminals that he had represented. Josef had no bad aura about him. He was the head of his family, caring but strict. Josef is a family man with good intentions. Maya said he encouraged Josef to give his own memory of the events that took place, adding that he just wanted to get to know who Josef Fritzl was and how he became to be the way that he was, saying that he allowed Josef to talk while he listened. He said that he advised Josef not to talk to anyone else, adding that he needed to rest and later he may speak to others again, but not now. Meanwhile, police were acting that anyone who had ever lived in the Fritzl home as a tenant to please come forward to be talked to, as within those 24 years, over 100 people had moved in and out of the rental rooms in the home. Forensic teams were still combing through the home and through the cellar, as well as over 300 officers and investigators working around the clock on the case. One of the forensic investigators said combing through the cellar was overwhelming and it was extremely depressing. He added that they could not even stay down there longer than an hour at a time without having to come up for fresh air, as there was hardly any air at all down there. It is very difficult, and we're going to have to figure something out about being able to spend more time down there due to the horrible air quality and the circulation. Several of the investigators had to later have therapy due to working this case. Within a week of being rescued, Elisabeth was now able to leave the medical clinic for a few hours each day by ambulance. She would dress in a nurse uniform disguise in order to throw off the many reporters that were camped out in front of the clinic when she drove away in the ambulance. She was now strong enough to go to the hospital for a few hours each day to spend time with Kirsten, who was still in a coma, and her kidneys and other organs were now starting to shut down. The doctor who had been treating her since she came into the hospital 2 weeks prior said that she was in critical condition and would be kept in a coma indefinitely, adding that Kirsten was in a life-threatening situation, which happened mainly due to a lack of oxygen. Rosemary and Elisabeth's other children were all undergoing extreme psychiatric treatment at the clinic. Stefan and Felix would spend hours and hours inside the dark dungeon replica where they felt safe. They both suffered extreme nightmares. Felix would oftentimes crawl into the replica just to feel safe. The boys were also having a very hard time being separated from Elisabeth at all, and for any amount of time, which worried the doctors because they needed to have more independence without Elisabeth being right there with them all the time, or they were not going to be able to face the outside world with any sort of independence. The two families that Josef Fritzl created were worlds apart. Elisabeth, Stefan, and Felix had a slow rhythm of life in the dungeon, while Lisa, Monica, and Alex were more fast-paced, and they were wanting to go back to school, see all of their friends again. But with the media being so intense, none of the children could leave the clinic. Chapter 21, The Devil Himself. Thursday, May the 1st. The local newspaper put in an article about the nurse that Josef had raped at knife point 41 years ago. The nurse, now 65 years old, had seen a news broadcast about him, and she immediately recognized him by his eyes. She recalled to the reporter how Josef had crawled through her basement window and gained access into her home while her husband was at work. Josef came into her bedroom, woke her up holding a butcher knife to her throat, saying that he would kill her if she made a sound. She added that at the time, Josef was a well-known predator in the area. He rode his bicycle around through the streets stalking women. During this time, Josef was married to Rosemary and had 4 children. The nurse was a young mother herself. Another newspaper printed an article explaining how they had obtained old criminal records of Josef's from 1967, proved that he was indeed a convicted sex offender, and he also had a prior arrest for indecent exposure and an arrest for attempted rape. A long-retired sheriff from Josef's past convictions was interviewed by the newspaper, saying that they had tracked him down by his palm print that was found at the scene. He was then identified by the victim as well as another woman that was able to escape him when he had drug her into the woods and attempted to rape her as well, but she was able to escape him before he did. Josef had a record of this sort of behavior that dated all the way back to 1959. Over the next several weeks, detectives had another look at over 700 unsolved and cold cases throughout the decades to see if they had any sort of connection to Josef Fritzl. Josef's attorney had instructed him, at this point, do not speak to anyone about anything, and he made the same announcement to the public, saying that Josef will not be saying one word to anyone, and added that it was likely that Josef would be using a defense of insanity for the current charges that he was facing to see if he can even be considered competent to stand trial or responsible for his actions due to the possible mental health conditions. By Friday morning, Kirsten's condition had taken a turn for the worst. Doctors saying that her chances of survival now were very low due to multiple organ failures. It was also reported that Josef had not even checked on Elisabeth for 3 days after she had given birth to the twins. He was not even aware of their births until he went into the dungeon and saw that Michael had died, and then tossing his body into the incinerator, adding that Josef had reportedly raped Elisabeth in front of her oldest children. For Elisabeth's first 9 years in the dungeon, there was only a very small one-room area. Police described Josef as being the devil himself and being morally subhuman. Josef, hearing and reading all of the media reporting, was making him furious, mostly because he was being charged with the murder of an infant, saying that the baby was dead when he first laid eyes on him. Josef's attorney said that he had admitted that Elisabeth had the twins alone, and when he went down to the cellar and learned that one of the babies had died, he put its body into the furnace, adding that Josef was emotionally destroyed and he had no regrets about anything that he had done. He went on to say that since he had become Josef's attorney, that he was receiving loads of hate mail and even death threats, such as going to his office and executing him. However, he said he would not be intimidated or swayed by the public mobs, adding that he was a former boxer, and beside that, every person deserves a right to a good defense, and Josef is not a monster, he is a human being. During a television interview, a former tenant who had lived in one of the rented rooms for 12 years broke down in tears, saying once Josef had actually told him that the house would make history. The tenant emotionally said, "I can't stop thinking about the noises I would hear late at night and watching him bringing the loads of food into the cellar with the wheelbarrow. It's so hard to believe that his wife never knew what was going on down there." He went on to say that he did see another man go into the cellar once with Josef, but believed that it was a plumber that was helping him to install a toilet down there. Another tenant that had been given several TV interviews had also been a friend and schoolmate of Elisabeth, saying when he moved in there, one of their mutual friends had said to him, "Don't you know who he is? He raped Sissy." He said that he assumed that the police already knew about that. Otherwise, he would have reported it. He went on to say, looking back now, there were flags that something was off in the home, like food that was disappearing from his and other renters' refrigerators. He added that he wished so bad that he would have put some emphasis on all of those flags and checked them out, and maybe Elisabeth could have been rescued much earlier. Friday, May the 2nd, teams were scouring the entire perimeter of the Fritzl home with sonar and bloodhounds to see if any children may be buried in the garden area. Inside the cellar, forensics teams were filming, photographing, and mapping out every inch of it. They were surprised to learn that only 1/3 of the dungeon's tunnels and turns were being used by Elisabeth and her children. The other 2/3 were bricked up and unused. Police found all of the blueprints and the receipts that Josef had saved from the start of building the underground prison. Materials, appliances, supplies, and even receipts for the food, gifts, and clothes that he had purchased for his secret underground family. Prosecutors said that Josef Fritzl was the exact opposite of a person that is not all there in the head. He is a highly intelligent person, but he is a very sick monster. Chapter 22, Under Siege. Josef Fritzl's House of Horrors quickly became one of the biggest national news stories in many years. The case was making the front page in newspapers as far away as India, China, and even Russia. Meanwhile, the Fritzl family was under siege at the clinic, as there were reports and media from around the world literally camped out outside the clinic. There was even a $1.5 million offer for a current photo of Elisabeth. An artist had sketched a painting that was being used of what she may look like now, and this was of a white-haired old woman. Reporters were even trying to sneak through the barricades of the clinic to snap a photo. Paris military had to be brought in with guard dogs and infrared cameras and thermal imaging to secure the premises of the clinic from the media paparazzi. 17 reporters were arrested over a span of only a few days, trying to snap a fast photograph of Elisabeth. One reporter even wore a police uniform and attempted to walk into the clinic, and of course, he was quickly arrested. Another was dressed in camo from head to toe. He climbed a large tree, trying to snap an aerial shot of the family. A spokesman for the clinic pleaded with the media to back away from trying to take a photo of Elisabeth right now, as it could set her recovery back for months. The family's therapy originally was to have them go outside and walk around and get accustomed to the world. However, this was not possible with the media literally storming the clinic and even climbing trees. Reporters were also camped out on the side of the road behind the Fritzl home for more than a week. Neighbors of the Fritzls had even rented out their balconies to reporters and journalists for huge sums of money. The home was now being referred to by the public as the incest house, and thousands of tourists were driving by the home, creating a circus-like situation. A deputy said it was just shocking that thousands of gawkers, not to mention it shows zero respect for Josef's victims. Across the street, Rosemarie's car had been parked since the beginning of the investigation. Visible in the back seat was a large photo of her granddaughter Lisa. A reporter did ask an officer why the vehicle had not been searched also, and he was told to mind his own business. A few days after the reporter asked this, the vehicle was towed to the police station for a forensic search. Josef Fritzl was in solitary confinement at the prison 45 miles away because he had admitted to his cellmate that he had imprisoned his own daughter and made her his personal sex slave for 24 years. His cellmate lost all control after hearing Josef admit what his crime was and tried to kill him, so Josef was moved to solitary. Josef's attorney was now saying that with him being under 24-hour suicide watch, he was distraught and very depressed, and that Josef had been diagnosed as being mentally ill with schizophrenia by a psychiatrist who had evaluated him in prison. His attorney added that this means that Josef is not responsible for his actions. He added that locking Josef up is not the correct thing to do because he needs professional psychological care. Josef had pleaded with Rosemarie to come and visit him at the prison, but she flat out refused. Josef was cleared of having any involvement in the murder of the 17-year-old girl found near his campsite. A special program was aired on TV about the case. State-appointed attorney for the Fritzl family spoke by saying, in verbatim, Elisabeth should be admired. She is a very strong woman. Much progress has been made in their recoveries, and the family is all working together now and helping each other. Elisabeth and all of her children are getting along very well. Efforts of the family, all getting back to normal, is looking great. An expert in PTSD also spoke, saying, the recovery is going to be a long and painful process. They are going to have to put together piece by piece what they have all been through, and they will have to come to terms with that. A doctor from the clinic said that the road to recovery for them is not going to be easy, and some of them may never be able to recover from their traumatic past. He compared it to almost the Holocaust, explaining that some of the children that came out of the Holocaust went on to be free and have families and careers, putting their horrific past behind them. The others that survived never recovered from their past, and they relived it every day mentally. Elisabeth and Felix had already gone through a setback during their time at the clinic. Doctors had been opening the blinds on the windows just a bit more each day. This proved to be a bad idea, as their very weak eyes just could not handle the sunlight, so they were given back the dark protective glasses. Josef's attorney appeared on TV that night, saying that he was working on an insanity defense for Josef, and that his client suffered from a serious mental disorder, and he did not just choose to do these crimes that he is charged with, adding that he could not imagine any sane person would ever have sex with their own flesh and blood. Josef is not responsible for his actions, and experts would be examining his client the next morning to decide if he was indeed certifiably insane, which would mean if he is indeed declared insane, he would serve his time inside a mental facility instead of a prison. He went on to say that if the experts do declare that he is of sound mind, he would absolutely be challenging their opinions with a second opinion. That is the defense's right under the law. Kirsten's condition was now showing slight improvement. However, reports had started coming out that the police were now thinking that she too had been raped by Josef, adding that after Josef got tired of Elisabeth and started finding her unattractive, he possibly turned to his daughter granddaughter, Kirsten, as being his newest sex slave. When her doctor was asked about these allegations, he said that he could not comment on that as of yet, as it was not possible to check her for possible sexual abuse while she was still in a coma. The doctor added that he was thankful to God that her condition was now stabilized and was not life-threatening any longer, and she was slowly being weaned off the drugs that she was being given. Police were now saying that they believed they knew what Josef's motive may be, and that was to recreate his first family using his own daughter. But after 20 years in an underground prison, Elisabeth prematurely aged and looked almost exactly like her mother. So is it possible that 73-year-old Josef did turn to the next young daughter to satisfy his twisted desires? At the press conference that afternoon, the sheriff told the public that Josef planned and worked on his dungeon prison secretly for 6 years before he made his move and locked Elisabeth in there. The next morning's newspaper's front page was how Josef Fritzl was a regular at the brothels since the 1960s. His reputation there was being an extreme pervert, and many of the girls that worked at the brothel refused services to him because he was just too weird and controlling with everyone. All the prostitutes from one city all the way to the next knew him. Chapter 23, I Could Have Killed Them All. Tuesday, May the 6th. Josef's attorney went to the prison to talk to Josef. This was done so that the attorney could show the public that he was indeed a human and not a monster. During the interview, Josef told about his peculiar childhood, saying that his father was just a loser that never handled his responsibilities, and he cheated on his mother, so she kicked him out when he was 4 years old. From that point on, Josef said, I was her man, as I was the only man in the house. He went on to talk about how he always had strong sexual feelings towards his own mother. He was very attracted to her as she was a strong woman who taught him discipline and the values of being a hard worker. She was the very best woman in the world, adding that it would be crazy to say that his mother sexually abused him, and he loved her across all boundaries. I was in complete awe of my mother. That does not mean there was anything between us. There never was, and there never would have been. Josef did admit that he had fantasized about having sex with his mother, but he was always strong enough to keep his desires for his mother under control, adding that when he was older, he dated a few girls and then he met Rosemarie, who was much more shy and weak than his mother had been. He went on to talk about how he had always had an obsession with incest from an early age, and how he had always been attracted to Elisabeth, who he referred to throughout the interview as his second wife. Talking about Rosemarie, Josef said that he chose Rosemarie because he wanted his wife to bear him many children, as he did not want any child to have to grow up like he did, an only child. I had dreamt of having a very large family since I was a small child, and Rosemarie agreed to help me make that dream a reality. I loved Rosemarie then, and I still do. When asked about the past rape conviction that he spent 18 months in prison for, he replied saying, I do not know why I did that. I wanted to be a good husband and father, so I do not know what drove me to that. When asked about the neighbors and friends claiming that he was brutally abusive to his children, he calmly said, I come from an old school line of discipline during the Nazi times, where respect of authority was mandatory, so I suppose I followed my own upbringing in a disciplinary way that does not exist today. I strive for well-being and mannerable children. I am not the monster that I am portrayed by the media as. I could have killed them all. Then no one would have ever known about any of this. Attorney asked him how he would explain someone else that had locked away his own daughter in an underground prison and repeatedly raped her for 24 years. Josef calmly replied by saying, on first thought, I would think he is a beast, a monster, if you will. The only time during the interview that Josef lost his calm and cool composure at all was when he was asked about the claims that he had started molesting Elisabeth when she was only 11 years old. Josef snapped back fast and hard in anger, raising his voice and saying, that is not true. I only had sex with her later, much later. She had been in the cellar for a long time before I had sex with her. When asked how long he planned to build the dungeon before he actually started constructing it, he replied by saying 2 or 3 years beforehand, around 1981 or 1982, when I started building a room in the cellar for Elisabeth. He talked with pride about how he had installed the very heavy concrete and steel door that worked by remote control and had a code that had to be keyed in, bragging about how he soundproofed the entire room and installed a toilet and even brought in a stove, fridge, and electricity for lights all by himself. He referred to the dungeon as his own personal kingdom that no one could ever enter into, bragging about how he made it clear that the cellar was his office, and that was enough to keep his family from prying when he was down there, as they all knew they better obey his rules. When he was asked why he chose Elisabeth to put in the dungeon, he said that ever since she had started puberty, she stopped obeying him, going out all the time to bars and coming home stinking of alcohol and smoke. He added that he tried to save her from the streets by getting her a job, but she would miss many days of work. She ran away 2 times with people of low standards. I would always go and get her and bring her back home, but she would always run away again. That is why I had no choice except to build a place and take her by force to lock her away from the bad influences of the outside world. Josef denied ever chaining or handcuffing Elisabeth while she was in the dungeon, saying, "Why would I have done that? She had no chance of escaping the dungeon anyway," adding that it was long after he had locked her away that his situation started running away in his mind. There were a few times he did wonder if he should just set her free from the cellar, but I just could not make that decision because I knew that every day she was down there, it would make my crime that much worse. I was afraid of being arrested, and my wife and family and friends learned what I had done, and eventually too much time had passed, and it was too late to try and bring Elisabeth back out and into the world. He went on to say that the longer Elisabeth was in the cellar, the stronger his desire to have sex with her became, saying that the first time that they had sex was in the spring of 1985, adding that he just could not control his desires at that point any longer. So during the night, he got up from his own bed and went down into the cellar and laid Elisabeth on the bed and had sex with her, adding that he knew Elisabeth did not want him to do it, but the obsession to do the forbidden with my daughter was just too much for me to withstand. Asked if Elisabeth had ever tried to resist him, and he said that she had never screamed or tried to fight him off of her. When asked what happened when he and Elisabeth first learned that she was pregnant, he replied saying that Elisabeth was very worried about the future, of course, saying that he brought Elisabeth books about what to expect during the pregnancy and what to do when the time came, adding that he also supplied her with aspirin and disinfectants and even diapers for the baby. When asked about how he felt after the births of Kirsten and Stefan, he said he was very excited and proud, and it felt good to know that he had a good wife and a proper family in the cellar. Josef was asked what would have happened to Elisabeth and the children if he had been killed during one of his extended vacations that he took regularly. In his answer, he claimed that he did prepare for that in the event it happened, claiming that he had a timer that he had set each time he left, and in the event that he did not return by the set time, the steel door would open on its own. So if I had died, Elisabeth and the children would have been set free. Josef proudly said he tried very hard to be nice to his family downstairs. He often brought them books and gifts and stuffed animals. He watched television with the children, while Elisabeth cooked dinner for them all. We would all sit at the table and have dinner together. We celebrated all birthdays, and I would bring cake and presents. We even celebrated Christmas in the cellar. I brought in a Christmas tree, and we decorated and put Christmas gifts under it. Asked why he had brought Lisa upstairs in 1993 for Rosemarie to raise, he claimed that he and Elisabeth planned it all together between the two of them, and it was because Lisa was so sickly and the ventilation in the cellar seemed to be making her condition worsen. We both concluded that she would not live if she remained in the cellar, going on to say that he brought the other two that were born in 1994 and 1996 named Monica and Alex upstairs due to their being weak and difficult, and they were often ill due to complications during their birth. He went on to say that with each new birth, Elisabeth dedicated her life to her children and cared nothing for herself, so his control over her got much easier, as she was not rebelling at all about anything he told her to do. Josef even patted his own back, saying in 2002, after the birth of Felix, he brought Elisabeth a gift of a washing machine so she no longer had to hand wash their clothing. Asked if he believes having his second family in the cellar could have been harmful to their health, Josef replied by saying, "Yeah, sure, of course. Elisabeth never complained. She stayed strong, even when her teeth were rotting and falling out one by one. She constantly had cramps and headaches. She stayed strong and did not really complain. But I did notice the children were constantly getting weaker every day." Asked why he finally decided to release them all in 2008, and he replied by saying, "I wanted to free them all. I was getting older and finding it harder to get around, and knew that very soon I would not be able to care for my second family. He went on to explain that he and Elisabeth had the plan to tell the outside world that she had been held for the last 24 years by a cult. He admitted that he did have worries that Elisabeth and the children would betray him and not follow through with the plan. He then added, well, that betrayal happened sooner than I had expected it to, due to the issue with Kirsten escalating. After mentioning Kirsten, Josef raised his voice in anger, saying Kirsten would not even be alive today if it wasn't for me. I made sure that she got to the hospital. Josef said the children upstairs called him Daddy, even though they knew he was their grandfather, and the children downstairs called him Grandfather, as Elisabeth had never told them the truth. Josef said he was very proud of the way Elisabeth had raised the children to always be nice to their grandfather. Asked how he was able to prevent any attempts of escape from the cellar. It was not hard. I did not need to use any sort of physical violence. Elisabeth, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix accepted me completely as the head of the family. They knew they would never have the strength to try and attack me. Not to mention, they knew I was the only person in the world that knew the code to open and close the door. Josef denied ever threatening them with poison gases if they tried to open the door. He did, however, say that he told them if they touched the door, they would be electrocuted and die. When Josef asked if he wanted to die himself now that he had been caught and everyone knew what he had done, he said, no, I only want redemption. I always knew during those 24 years that what I was doing was wrong. I must have been a madman to do what I did, but I was not able to escape my double life. Later, many people questioned the interview, contemplating if he had said these things as a way to prove he was indeed mentally insane and should be placed into a mental facility as opposed to a prison. On Wednesday morning, the state prosecutor interrogated Josef for 2 hours inside his cell. Afterward, the prosecutor told an online reporter that Josef was very cooperative. Meanwhile, there were new laws being presented and discussed to have stricter penalties on sex-related cases. Laws such as chemical castration and not erasing sexual offense crimes after 15 years. These new law discussions were being brought up due to the fact that Josef had been allowed to adopt and foster children despite being a convicted rapist. After debating the proposed new laws, the minister agreed to tighten adoption and foster parents' rules and guidelines to prevent another Josef Fritzl from manipulating the system. Elisabeth's attorney, who was present at the debate, spoke up and said they would be going for compensation as Josef Fritzl still had 5 properties in his name. Wednesday night, 500 people gathered together to show support for the Fritzl family. School children had made a large banner that was unrolled, which read, "Wishing you strength on your path through life. It was hell for you. Now we wish you lots of sunshine. We are with you." Others held up signs for the media saying, "Leave us alone." An organizer said, "This town is ready to move on. I am here because what one man did has now reflected on all of us, but I am proud to be from Amstetten." Chapter 24, We, the Whole Family. Josef Fritzl was making front-page news across the world in newspapers and top-selling magazines. Josef's photo was plastered across the fronts with headlines such as, "I could have killed them all," and "Dungeon Dad's Sick Defense," and "I lusted after my mother," with a photo of Josef sitting in the sun wearing a pair of swimming Speedos. Friday morning, Josef was escorted without cuffs or shackles by wards of the prison court. There was a 15-minute hearing held with his attorney present. He was told that he would most likely be facing murder by negligence in the death of little Michael, and this carries a sentence of life in prison. The judge ordered Josef to remain in prison for another month as the investigation was still ongoing. Outside, reporters were being told by sources that the investigation would take up to 6 months to complete. Josef's attorneys was also speaking with reporters outside and was saying that Josef missed his family and wondered why his wife had not visited him yet, adding that his client is not well mentally and his biggest worry is how his family is getting along without having him there with them. A couple of hours after Josef's closed hearing, there was another public press conference. The sheriff explained how investigators had uncovered 2 more rooms in the cellar that were sealed with concrete, saying that they believed these sealed rooms were being used as a storage space, and at this time, they are all focusing the searches on the outside grounds, looking for possible human remains using cadaver dogs for the most part, so they would not have to excavate the entire property. At the clinic, Rosemarie, Elisabeth, and the children were sharing Mother's Day together. They seemed to be adjusting to each other very well now. Stefan was having serious issues with standing up straight, as well as motor skills and coordination. He spent the majority of his time just watching his goldfish swim in the aquarium, which was the same thing that he had done when he was in the dungeon. Lisa, Monica, and Alex were upset that their normal lives had been uprooted. They wanted to go back to school and to see their friends. They had always had freedom living upstairs, but now the doctors advised that they were not allowed to leave the clinic either due to the chaos surrounding the entire family. The children were being homeschooled by tutors at the clinic. They also watched Disney movies and read hundreds of letters from supporters that wrote them from all around the world. Elisabeth was beside herself while reading these letters. She decided to get her mother and the children together and spend a couple of days making a large banner that could be displayed in a store window in town, just to thank everyone for their support and care. They all worked together and they decorated the large banner with colorful rays of sunshine, rainbows, and happiness. And across the top of the banner, Lisa wrote, "We, the whole family, want to thank all of you for having sympathy for our fate. Your empathy is helping us to get through this and proves that there is still good and honest people. We hope there will be a time that we can return to having normal lives." They each traced around their hands and they wrote their own heartfelt messages inside. Most of the children mentioned their oldest sister, Kirsten, inside their traced hand palms. At the bottom of the banner was a large heart with Kirsten's name inside. Kirsten was still in a coma at the hospital. Rosemarie was now also having medical issues. When she had learned what Joseph had done, she had a nervous breakdown. She was also being treated for severe heart problems. New information about what had happened those 24 years was being reported several times a day, and Rosemarie was having a hard time coping and hearing the horrors that were happening underneath her in her own home. On Monday, May the 27th, Kirsten's condition had stabilized. She was showing signs of improvement, giving her medical team hope that she may make a full recovery. So they started reducing her medications to slowly bring her out of the medically induced coma. Their main concern now was possible brain damage. The infections and lack of oxygen had been so severe. This was a possibility. Each day, Elisabeth would be dressed in her nurse disguise, wearing a red wig and a nurse's uniform. She would walk out the front door of the clinic and through the gates and pass many news crews as she made her way to the awaiting ambulance. All the reporters and journalists never knew that it was Elisabeth walking by them every day. Chapter 25, Frankenstein. On Monday, May the 12th, the team of psychologists began their examinations of Josef to give their professional opinions of his attorney's claims that his client was indeed insane. These examinations would take several weeks to conduct before they would be able to give a true and accurate decision of their opinions if Josef was indeed aware of the extreme abuse and horror that he had inflicted on his family. These expert decisions would decide whether Josef would be spending the rest of his natural life in prison or in a mental facility. The lead psychologist announced to the public that she would be questioning him about his entire life, from childhood to current, as she will not allow public opinion into her unbiased professional exams and evaluations. She explained that she had conducted evaluations in the past with murderers that tried to fake their mental states in order to be deemed unfit to stand trial. However, that is very hard to fake, as there are many different examinations that are conducted with a number of symptoms. It is very rare that trying to fake mental health problems is successful for the criminal. She added that her conclusion would take anywhere from a few days to several weeks. It depends on how well the person cooperates. Press was printing several theories as to why Josef Fritzl would have committed the crimes that he did. One of the popular theories that was being put out, he had Frankenstein syndrome. A German psychologist interviewed said he was like Dr. Frankenstein. He was delusional and he felt euphoria, knowing that he was the controller of life and death of his victims. He is the definition of evil. He is the devil. Another psychologist said he could not give a proper diagnosis without sitting down and talking to him one-on-one. However, if he had to give speculation, it would be that his childhood and being in the middle of the Nazi war held some bearing on his crimes, as well as his strange obsession with his own mother and the extreme brutal abuse that he considered a discipline that was handed down to him by his mother that he adored. A team of forensic investigators started going through the work that Josef had used while building the dungeon. They were trying to come to a conclusion together if Josef had built it by himself or if someone else had helped him. With him moving out tens of thousands of pounds of dirt, that would have taken him 17 large trucks to haul away. Also the fact that he had fully furnished the dungeon with beds, a full-size kitchen with appliances, and even a washing machine, all without anyone ever noticing him do it. It almost seemed impossible, considering that the home sits on the edge of a very busy street in one of the main parts of town. The team also put much emphasis into the wired electricity, the plumbing, the security, and the 8 doors that led into the underground prison. Sonar had located the sealed 2 rooms, which were to be broken down and inspected as well. There were several rooms located in the cellar that was not being used as a second family home. One of the rooms looked to be a secret office space that Josef used to keep his receipts, documents, blueprints, and even found was his own personal diaries with writings that dated back to before he built the prison dungeon. A different team wearing hazmat protective suits began clearing up the dungeon. Over several days, they removed loads and loads of trash, mostly consisting of empty cereal and pizza boxes, fast food wrappers, and empty aluminum cans of food. This was being done while hundreds of gawkers from all over the world were circling around the home, as well as stopping and getting out to take their picture in front of it. There was even a tour bus that was located 250 miles away that was charging for a seat on the tour to go to the Fritzl home and stop in front of it so the gawkers could see the home and even take their photos in front of it. The bus would then drive back the 250 miles and pick up another load of awaiting gawkers to take this paid tour. The community was coming more and more frustrated with the attention that this case had brought into their once quiet, peaceful town. One said it was bad enough with all the press and the reporters camping and being here all hours of the day and night. But now, the tour buses and gawkers from around the world? This is all too much. Wednesday morning, the banner that Elisabeth and the children made to thank everyone was displayed in a store window. Everyone in town went to the storefront to see the banner, and many cried as they read the heartfelt messages from each of the children and Elisabeth. Later that evening, the doctor at the clinic gave a press conference, explaining that it would still be several more months before the family would be able to return to the world. And even when they did, they would have different names. Their identity would be completely changed. They would then be living their lives similar to someone who is entering into a witness protection program. This will be done for their own safety. They are going to have to slowly adjust to being in this new world, as well as being able to get used to each other. He went on to say that Elisabeth, Stefan, and Alex were going to require extended therapy even after returning to the outside world, as they were having complications still trying to adjust to daylight. They were also receiving therapies teaching them how to climb stairs and be able to move around in larger spaces, as this was something very new to Stefan and Alex, and Elisabeth also now suffered very frail bones and joints as well, and doing these things were very hard for her, adding that each of the family members required different types of therapy. The children upstairs were very resentful that their freedom had been taken from them, and they were now isolated with this other family that they never even knew existed. And then the children from the cellar were very timid and was needing to slowly adjust to being around other people as well, any other ailments that they faced. Even the task of standing up straight was very challenging for them. These children are from 2 separate worlds. The doctor used an example of children's differences. To one set of children, seeing new things is fascinating to them, while the other set will just roll their eyes as it is nothing impressive to them at all. Like, one set of the children will see a large cloud in the sky and be absolutely mesmerized by watching it move by, while the other set of children find it very boring to look at a cloud floating by in the sky. So as you see, these children are very different. He goes on to ask that the media and the public to please give them time and peace at the clinic, adding that a security officer for the clinic was badly hurt by a reporter trying to break in just to snap a photo of the family. This madness has to end. We are doing all we can to protect them from this outside stress. The family's lawyers spoke up saying the media is aggressive and they are technically imprisoning Elisabeth, Stefan, and Felix all over again, adding that the children would love to walk outside into the open air, to see and feel the rain on their faces. This is something they have never experienced in their entire lives. To breathe in the fresh air, to touch the trees and the grass, but these things cannot be given to them as they cannot even leave the inside of the clinic due to the madness that's awaiting them outside of the clinic walls. This family will most likely have to move out of the country when they can be returned to the outside world. They are never going to be able to live a normal life here as they are being hunted as prey by the media. A few days after this press conference, new identities were given to Rosemary, Elisabeth, and all of the children. On Thursday, May the 15th, a doctor at the hospital was making his morning rounds when he saw Kirsten open her eyes. She saw the doctor standing there smiling at her, and she smiled back at him. She had awoken from her coma. The doctors had hoped that Elisabeth would be there when she opened her eyes for the very first time, because she had never laid eyes on anyone in this whole world other than her mother, Josef, and her siblings. The doctors rushed to call for Elisabeth to come to the hospital as soon as possible so she could be with her. Everyone was very relieved and excited that it appeared that she had no brain damage. Following 2 weeks, Kirsten had her mother and doctors beside her constantly. She was getting stronger and stronger. Kirsten still had the many tubes and catheters that were inserted into her body, so it was hard to get her to do the things that we was asking her to do. Preparing her for the removal of the breathing tube was concerning as well, as she was having to learn how to breathe on her own as well as swallow her food and drinks. But with her mother being there to talk to her and motivate her, she progressed wonderfully. 2 weeks after waking up from the coma, she was removed from the ventilator and steps began to start her on her next phase of her long recovery process. Later that day, a release was made by authorities saying that Josef had manipulated Elisabeth all of these years by telling her that dangerous gases would be released if she tried to escape, as there was no setup of these said gases at all in the cellar door. Also revealed was there was also no sort of remote-controlled timer to open the doors to free Elisabeth and the children had he have died during one of his lengthy vacations. Chapter 26, Miracle. Monday, May the 19th, the front page of the local newspaper reported that Elisabeth would soon be giving a television interview talking about her 24 years locked up inside the prison. Elisabeth's interviews would be aired the following Monday night. But just a few hours later, the family attorney came forward, completely debunking this claim by the newspaper, saying that Elisabeth had not even spoke with police yet, and there is no truth whatsoever in this claim. There is no TV appearance of Elisabeth Fritzl planned at all, as this is not in the family's best interest to go public, even though I'm receiving offers daily from various stations. On Wednesday, May the 21st, investigators were conducting several sound tests inside the dungeon to determine if anyone could have heard anything upstairs in the home. A credible source from inside the prison told a newspaper reporter that Josef's demeanor had changed drastically since talking with a team of psychologists, saying, quote, "When he first came in, he was arrogant and showed no signs of empathy or remorse at all, but now he cries all night. He has lost a lot of weight, and he is a broken man that is just wasting away." Since Josef had been incarcerated, he had only had one visitor, and that was an unidentified family friend. His attorney said that he was still asking for Rosemary and Elisabeth to visit with him, adding that Josef said he wanted to see them to find out how they are because he was worried about them and he wanted to explain things to them. Elisabeth's attorney said in an interview that the family's team of attorneys were contemplating suing Josef for the damages that he had caused them and the $1.5 million the family now owed the facilities for their care and therapies. Of course, this will ultimately be Elisabeth's decision. Josef does own several properties. However, some of them do have mortgages on them in the sum of several $1,000,000. We have to determine if selling these properties would leave any profit after settling their mortgages and debts. At the hospital, Kirsten had been giving a portable CD player and a headset to listen to, hoping it would motivate her by listening to one of her favorite artists, Robbie Williams. A few days later, doctors noticed that she was almost dancing in her bed listening to music, even though she was still attached to the breathing tube. On Sunday, June the 1st, as Elisabeth sat by the hospital bed and watched, Kirsten's breathing tube was finally removed. When she took her very first breath ever of air outside of the dungeon, she gave her mother a heavenly smile. The doctor that removed the tube gave a big smile and said, "Hello, Kirsten." Kirsten looked at the doctor, smiled, and said, "Hello." This was actually a miracle, considering how close to death that she was for so long. But from that point on, her progress escalated fast. The next phase of her recovery was being done by her mother. Elisabeth took on the part of being a life coach for her daughter, encouraging her to do what the doctors were telling her to do. She was going to have to start using her muscles again so they could get stronger. Kirsten had been in a coma for 6 weeks and it was imperative that she start using her bones and muscles again. Just a few days later, she enjoyed her first meal in 6 weeks. She also tasted for the very first time in her life fresh fruit. Even though there was some damage to her organs, the doctor said that she was expected to make a full recovery. Kirsten was making an amazing physical recovery. However, her mental recovery was far different. On Friday, June the 6th, Josef appeared in court. The judge ordered him to remain in jail for a further 2 months, as the prosecutor had said they needed more time to complete the investigation. The prosecution also disclosed to the judge that DNA had proved that Josef did not have any accomplices in his crimes and he had acted alone. Sources inside the prison also revealed that Josef Fritzl had received over 200 love letters from women around the world. These letters offered him support and even romance, telling him that he was a good man and he was just misunderstood. But the hate mail that he was receiving, they came by the sackfuls, and it far outweighed the love and support letters. He stayed alone in his cell for 23 and a half hours a day. He only went outside for 30 minutes each day so he could take in the sunshine, but he was always terrified that he would be brutally attacked by the other inmates. He had requested an anti-aging cream for his face, and he was also complaining of having stomach aches frequently. Then it was reported that he was suffering from a heart condition and may not even live long enough to go to trial. Prosecutors said the trial could well be delayed up to 2 years because it may take that long before Elisabeth, Kirsten, and Stefan would be well enough to talk to the police. When this news made its way to Elisabeth, she was horrified, saying that she wanted to speak to them as soon as possible. She wanted to do everything she could to prevent her father from getting away with the crimes that he had done to her and her children. Saturday morning, Kirsten took her first steps with the help of her mother and the doctor. Just a few hours after taking her first steps, she was released from the ICU and taken by ambulance to the clinic to visit with the rest of her family. Once at the clinic, Elisabeth held to Kirsten's arm as they walked into the clinic, where her siblings and her grandmother were anxiously awaiting her arrival. Chapter 27, A New Start. On Wednesday, June the 11th, the main doctor that had stayed by Kirsten's side the entire time was set to have a public press conference, and this was to discuss Kirsten's miraculous recovery. The doctor described her recovery as nothing short of a miracle, explaining her situation upon arrival and her milestones and fallbacks while she was in the ICU, and now finally being able to speak about her incredible reunion with her family. While he was taking questions, the doctor was asked what may have caused Kirsten's severe condition, and he replied saying that he still was not sure, but it was possibly due to a severe epileptic seizure. And as far as her multiple organ failures, he added, again, we are not sure what triggered this, but it was likely due to an infection that went untreated. He was able to say with almost certainty that Kirsten had indeed suffered a severe epileptic seizure, and she had bitten her tongue, which caused blood to go into her lungs. And it did appear that one of her lungs had failed due to this. Taking another question from reporters, he was asked if Kirsten had asked for anything specific after coming out of her coma. And the doctor replied saying that she had asked to go to a Robbie Williams concert when she got out of the hospital. When asked if he was able to say if Kirsten had also been molested by Josef Fritzl, the doctor said he could not answer that question. She was examined while she was in intensive care. However, the test results were inconclusive. In closing, the doctor thanked his hospital staff for being able to take Elisabeth out of the clinic in disguise every day to bring her to the hospital to be by her daughter's side. Several weeks later, the Fritzl family secretly moved out of the clinic and into a home in a small villa near the clinic. Over the next few days, moving vans were back and forth to the home, unloading furnishings for the home. They had lived at the clinic for over 2 months, and doctors were in hopes, with them moving out of the hospital atmosphere, they hoped that this move would help them to be able to live a normal life. Once moved into their new home, the family worked to get into a normal routine. Rosemarie and Elisabeth got up very early each morning and prepared breakfast together with the help of the clinic staff. After breakfast, Felix would play checkers with his grandmother. Kirsten would go to therapy, and the 4 older children would go into a large room in the home that was designated as a schoolroom, and their tutors would work with them on their assignments for the day. Stefan had been homeschooled by his mother since he was 5 years old in the dungeon, and she had taught him as best she could. His teachers were actually amazed by how advanced he was due to the circumstances he was in. After lunch, they were all free to do whatever they wanted. Stefan and Felix had a newfound enjoyment of playing video games together. The two also enjoyed walking outside and just exploring and looking at all of the nature, even though they still had to wear the dark glasses to protect their very weak eyes from the sun rays. Elisabeth's other siblings visited the house often. Her older sister brought her children as well, as they are close in age to Elisabeth's children, and they all enjoy playing together and just being rambunctious. One afternoon, Rosemary left accompanied by a police officer wearing street clothes and drove to her home, which was now known worldwide as the House of Horrors. She had to get police permission to enter her home, which she had not been back to since Josef's crimes had been uncovered. The permission was needed because the home was still legally a crime scene. Arriving at the home, there were police at the gates on 24-hour guard. They opened the gates going up to the house so Rosemary and the officer could drive through. Gawkers could be heard laughing and cameras snapping photos of Rosemary walking up to her front door. One of these photos appeared on the front page of the local newspaper the very next morning. Rosemary hurried up to the door and went inside the home without looking back towards the camera sounds and the laughing gawkers. She was inside the home for 40 minutes, and during this time, she went down into the cellar for the first time ever. As she looked around inside the dungeon, she felt numb. She then walked upstairs to her own apartment room and put items into 2 suitcases to bring back to her new home. In late June, doctors at the clinic told prosecutors that Elisabeth was still too weak and fragile to make the scheduled court statement that was set for early July, saying that she was still too traumatized to talk about her cellar situation, even by video link, even though earlier she had asked to have the chance to talk to them ASAP, knowing that Josef would also be in the room or live on the video, and her hearing him defend himself and challenge anything she said was just still too much for her to be able to withstand. Rosemary also scheduled to turn over evidence at this same hearing. Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix were scheduled to do the same, except at a later date. The hearing was then set to be put on hold indefinitely, awaiting Elisabeth's doctors to deem her well enough. The victim's statements would be video recorded and played during Josef's trial. This would mean that they would not have to be in the same room nor face-to-face with him. The judge that was appointed to preside over the trial was a 48-year-old female. One of her first tasks was to supervise the taking of Elisabeth's statement. The prosecution said they should be able to formally charge Josef by fall and have his trial in the winter months. Elisabeth's attorney learned that doctors were giving information to the media and threatened them with legal action if this did not stop immediately, adding that she had now obtained another attorney for the family to protect them from media intrusion. It was being reported that Josef was already writing his own personal story with plans to have it published and make millions of dollars from the book so he could pay off his defense team. Elisabeth was totally sickened to learn that her father was writing his side of the story to sell to the highest bidder. A former school friend of Elisabeth's, Krista, wrote a song titled 24 Years for Elisabeth, and the full lyrics of this song are written in the book. Krista said in her interview that she just wanted to reflect back on the kind of music they used to share together. She recorded it with a local musician onto a CD to sell and raise money for the family. She had heard that Elisabeth would be changing her name, and she was afraid that she may never hear from or see her childhood friend again. So she sent one of the CDs, and she wrote a letter to Elisabeth and mailed it to her at the clinic, not knowing that Elisabeth did not live there anymore. A few weeks later, she received a legal letter from Elisabeth's attorney, ordering her to take this CD off the market immediately and hand over any donations that she had received. She said that she was upset at the letter and thought that sending it legally was just a bit overboard. But at the end of the day, Elisabeth's well-being is all that matters. Elisabeth speaks. On Friday, July the 11th, it was the first day of a 3-day video filming of Elisabeth giving a deposition against her father at a secret location. She would have a doctor and a psychologist in the small room with her to help her along as she talked about every horrible, torturous thing that her father had done to her during those traumatic 24 years of being locked in the dungeon. During the recording of her testimony, Josef's attorney, as well as prosecutors, would sit in another room watching her testimony on a closed-circuit television monitor. They were both able to question her using a microphone. Josef waived his right to join his attorney and watch his daughter testify against him, so he remained in his prison cell. Elisabeth began by telling in painful detail how her father first started raping her when she was 11 years old. Then went into how her father had lured her into the dungeon and raped her over and over while she was handcuffed to a pole, and how he would make her watch porno movies with him and then force her to reenact his favorite parts, adding that if she ever dared to resist him or complain about his demands, he would punish her and the children by turning off the lights for several days, and he would stop bringing them food. Elisabeth explained how if she ever refused to have sex with him, then her children would suffer the consequences. He would kick them and be bad to them in front of her, adding that he would curse and belittle her and the children and would viciously discipline them if they dared to talk back to him. She went on to say when her father was away, they were able to live their own lives in the dungeon, but when he was home, it was always total silence in the cellar, that without him, they would die a miserable death, and they had no chance of surviving. The judge asked Elisabeth if she took her father's threats seriously, and Elisabeth answered in a small voice, yes. Most shocking and damning of all, perhaps, is when Elisabeth said, "He is the killer of my son, Michael." There was also a neonatal doctor present watching her testimony. He was called in to give his professional opinion as to if the terrible conditions in the dungeon could have caused Michael's death, and if so, then that would be the murder charge that they hoped to be able to charge Josef with. Prosecution spoke up, saying if Josef knew of Michael's failing health after birth, and he did nothing to help him receive medical attention, then that would absolutely be a charge of murder by neglect. 2 weeks after Elisabeth gave her testimony, both Kirsten and Stefan refused to testify against their father. This was a huge setback for prosecutors who really needed their testimonies to seal this murder charge. The children's testimonies would be crucial to this murder charge. As it stands, his charges were manslaughter, rape, coercion, unlawful imprisonment, and incest. Prosecutors worried that the manslaughter charge would be difficult to prove under Austrian law without forensic evidence. Also, he could receive only 1 sentence for the charges and be a free man in 10 years. But after they listened to and watched Elisabeth's very detailed and emotional testimony, they decided that Stefan and Kirsten's testimonies would not even be necessary, as Elisabeth had given a mountain of evidence against her father. Less than a month after the family all moved in together in the home at the village, Elisabeth demanded that her mother, Rosemarie, leave the home and never come back. It was said that Elisabeth was furious that her 3 children had been taken from her and brought upstairs, and now they were still calling Rosemarie Mom. Reports said that during the 3 months the family had been living together both at the clinic and in the home, Elisabeth had been asking her mother many questions, and the tension between the two had been slowly growing. Elisabeth wanted to know why her mother had stood by Josef after knowing about his 1967 conviction of rape. She was also mad that her mother had done nothing and never tried to protect her when her father started raping her when she was just 11 years old. Then finally, she asked her mother how she was never curious about what her father was doing in the cellar for all of those years and spending many nights down there while she was living upstairs. Rosemarie was completely lost and distraught at being kicked out of the new family home with no money at all, as she was not well and very weak and frail herself. With nowhere else to turn or go, she went to Lent to live with one of her other daughters, hoping soon she could get strong enough to get back on her own 2 feet, which she knew was not going to be easy now that she was 69 years old. The family attorney did confirm that Rosemarie had left the home, but denied allegations that Elisabeth had demanded her to leave. And he added, if you continue to run away from your past, you will be forever on the run. Rosemarie was spotted a few days later in a store in Linz. She had lost over 50 pounds. On July the 26th, she returned to her old house to take some of her belongings away. She was photographed by paparazzi moving furniture onto a trailer with the help of a moving crew. As she was leaving, a neighbor outside asked her how she was doing, and as Rosemarie drove away, she told the neighbor, I'm fine. Later that day, another moving van arrived at the home and took out more furniture. Rosemarie's sister spoke with a reporter, saying that her sister Rosemarie is also a victim, and she cannot understand why no one is giving her any help. A few days later, it was reported that Rosemarie announced that she would be divorcing Josef after the trial and she would take back her maiden name. It was also reported that Elisabeth had demanded this of her mother. Then, within just hours of this announcement to the public by Rosemarie, it was now being reported that the diaries that were discovered from the cellar belonging to Josef dated back many years, and now they were certain that Josef had also raped one of Rosemarie's sisters, as there was an entry in the diary that arrogantly detailed this rape, but it was not the sister that had been speaking with the reporters throughout this whole ordeal. Police said they were contemplating flooding the entire cellar with concrete to seal it completely off so it could never be used as some sort of sick and twisted money-making museum, adding that prosecutors were considering charging Josef with an additional slavery charge, still worried that he may only receive 10 years at sentencing with the currently planned charges. If this charge was handed down to someone for the first time in Austria's history, it carried a mandatory 20-year sentence, which would mean that Josef indeed would spend the rest of his natural life in prison. There were problems arising since Elisabeth's testimony 3 weeks prior. The manslaughter or murder charge would be near impossible to prove, as there was no forensic evidence, and it had been almost 13 years since little Michael's death. Also, the rape charge was going to be hard to prove as well. If Elisabeth said that she did not try to fight him off during those 24 years, at this point the only provable charge was incest, which he could be released from prison after only a few years. Epilogue, October the 22nd. The psychologist's 130-page report was leaked to the press. In the report, it stated that Josef was now blaming his abusive mother for his vile actions, saying to the doctor, "I was born into rape. I did control myself for a very long time. I could have done things much worse than locking up my daughter." He compared himself to a volcano, saying he was quiet on the surface, but then the evil inside him would break out, adding that when he would rape Elisabeth, he would never look at her face, and he would distance himself from who he was raping, and that he stopped having sex with Rosemarie on the very day he put Elisabeth into the dungeon. The doctor's conclusion was that even though Josef had extreme psychological and sexual disorders, he was sane enough to stand trial. However, she did recommend that he spend the remainder of his life inside a psychiatric unit, and he should never be released to be free again, and he was indeed a danger to society. It was also leaked to the media that he had also admitted to the doctor that he had locked his own mother in a room upstairs in their home until her death, with this claim by Josef being unconfirmed due to inconsistent stories. Maria Fritzl's fate still remains a mystery. On November the 13th, Josef Fritzl was formally charged with murder, rape, slavery, incest, abuse, coercion, and imprisonment. Josef's attorneys said that his client would not be appealing these charges, adding that Josef told him he knew what he done was wrong and that he needed therapy and help, and he wanted to know himself what was wrong with him to have made him do the things that he did. The author says that while writing this book, he reached out to a well-known psychologist and a fellow author that had written the book Inside the Mind of Scott Peterson. The doctor said that there was no way of knowing for sure about the mind of Josef Fritzl without having sat down with him one-on-one and doing an extensive and thorough exam on him, but he would speculate that there were two events that could have led to this tragedy, those being his childhood in Nazi Germany and the war, as well as his dysfunctional relationship with his mother, saying if his mother really seduced him and they had sex, that can become a factor for a young person as he develops psychosexually, which could also explain his fantasies he had that included his mother. He could have lived out his real-life fantasies with his daughter that he had about his mother when he was a young boy. The author adds much more detailed information that he received from the psychologist he spoke with in the book, and it is very interesting to say the least. And as always, I highly recommend you to read this book yourself, as my synopsis will not hold a cap, nor the words of the author. The link to this book is in the description box below. Author John GLATT is one of the most amazing and thorough true crime authors out there, always going deep inside every case he writes about and bringing to us details and interviews that we have not heard or read anywhere else before, and his extremely detailed description on each page. That said, if my synopsis here did catch your curiosity into this case, then please read the book to get the full and complete detailed story written and explained perfectly by author.
Today, Elisabeth Fritzl lives under a new identity in a secret Austrian village known only as Village X. This home is under constant CCTV surveillance, and police do patrol every corner of the home. The family does not allow interviews anywhere within their walls, and they decline to give any interviews themselves. Even though Elisabeth is now in her mid-50s, the last photo that was taken of her was when she was only 16 years of age. Rosemarie and Elisabeth did have a dispute, and Rosemarie did leave the home in Village X, but it was reported in 2010 by The Independent that Rosemarie and Elisabeth did reconcile, and Rosemarie maintains a close relationship with her 3 kids that she raised with Josef in the upstairs home. In 2019, it was also reported that Elisabeth, then 52 years old, she was in a romantic relationship with one of her bodyguards, 29-year-old Thomas Wagner. Thomas had moved in with Elisabeth and her children, who were then between the ages of 17 and 31. Elisabeth has stopped her psychiatric therapies, and at that time she was learning to drive and making friends with people in the community. As for Josef remains in prison today, in Stein Prison. This is Austria's most secure psychiatric prison. If the Vienna court had upheld the decision for him to be moved to a normal prison, he could have been eligible to apply to be freed on parole this year, 2023. The move was blocked when the Krems public prosecutor's office lodged a complaint, and this move was backed by the senior judges in Vienna. However, Josef still thinks that one day he's going to be a free man, despite everything he's done. Since his incarceration, he has divorced his wife, Rosemarie. This was done in 2012, and he divorced her when she stopped visiting him in prison. In March of 2016, Josef lost several teeth after getting into a fight with another inmate, after prisoners set up a fake online dating profile for him. In 2017, he paid $462 to have his surname changed to Maroff. Unnamed inmates claimed that Josef, better known to them as prisoner HNR 90632, wants to spend the last days of his life anonymous. His infamous House of Horrors in Amstetten was bought by Herbert Hauska for $177,868. The home has since been renovated, and it is now 10 separate apartments. They undertook a massive renovation project to bury the past. All 10 rooms are always rented out. According to reports, the basement where Elisabeth was held has since been filled in by the Austrian authorities to prevent other perverts from worshiping it as a shrine. In 2019, it was reported that he is suffering from dementia, and his condition is rapidly deteriorating, and he reportedly doesn't want to live anymore as he rots away in prison. He is extremely unpopular with the other inmates, and he has to be kept in solitary confinement with 4 guards watching him at all times. A fellow prisoner told local media that he was and still is separated from everyone else. He has totally withdrawn himself and barely leaves his cell. He doesn't want contact with others, and altogether it looks as though he has resigned himself to dying. He added that the other inmates do not want anything to do with him. This prisoner said, quote, "Just hearing his name makes me nauseous," end quote. Elisabeth has not had any contact with her father since he was jailed. She is now 56 years old, and Josef is 88.